Most people born into the highest echelons of nobility dream of only three things: endless mountains of gold, the finest enchanted wine, and the absolute authority to step on anyone beneath their boots. For the vast majority of young aristocrats, life is a playground. But for Ethan Vance, the eldest son of the prestigious House Vance, existence was something far more terrifying. From the very moment his lungs drew their first breath in this world, his skull wasn't filled with the innocence of a newborn baby. It was a howling tempest. A roaring, blood-drenched coliseum containing the complete memories, martial instincts, and ruthless political philosophies of over 100 legendary conquerors and grand scholars from forgotten eras. Warlords who had burned entire continents to ash. Grand chancellors who had overthrown divine dynasties with the stroke of a single poisoned quill. Master tacticians who had turned barren mud pits into slaughterhouses for enemy empires. Every single drop of their collective genius, their battlefield trauma, and their cold, calculating intellect was compressed directly into Ethan Vance's young mind. Now, if this were any typical power fantasy manhwa, you'd expect a kid like that to immediately jump out of his cradle, start dual-wielding greatswords at age 3, and proclaim himself the supreme overlord of the kingdom before he even lost his baby teeth. But Ethan Vance? Ethan possessed the wisdom of 100 ancient survivors, and if there was one universal truth that every single one of those 100 conquerors agreed upon, it was this: the nail that sticks out before it is forged into steel is the first one to be hammered into the dirt. In a cutthroat feudal society like the Kingdom of Valerius, showing unmatched genius without an army of your own to protect it wasn't a blessing. It was an express ticket to an early grave. So, Ethan Vance made a conscious, deliberate choice. He wore a mask. For the first 10 years of his life, Ethan Vance played the role of a completely ordinary, quiet, noble child. He showed no freakish magical talent. He swinged a wooden training sword with mediocre form. He spent his afternoons sitting in the palace gardens, quietly reading history books, basking in the only genuine warmth he had ever known: the love of his biological mother, Duchess Melissa. Melissa was a saint in a den of vipers. She was the legitimate first wife of Duke Patrick, a woman of grace and profound kindness who protected Ethan Vance from the toxic gossip of the noble courts. To Ethan Vance, who had inherited 100 lifetimes of warfare, bloodshed, and betrayal, his mother's gentle smile was the only oasis of peace in a world he knew was fundamentally rotten. He was content to live an unremarkable life just to keep that peace intact. He didn't care about conquering the world. He didn't care about glory. Until the winter Ethan Vance turned 10. A sudden, aggressive illness swept through the estate. In less than 3 weeks, despite the frantic prayers of the kingdom's top clerics, Duchess Melissa took her final breath. Standing in the freezing rain beside his mother's marble tombstone, young Ethan Vance did not cry. Inside his mind, 100 ancient voices whispered in grim understanding. They had seen this 1,000 times. They knew what came next. The fortress had lost its wall, and the hyenas were already circling the courtyard. Not even 6 months after Melissa was buried, Duke Patrick, a man whose vanity was only matched by his profound lack of backbone, remarried. Enter Duchess Elinor. Elinor was a woman sculpted out of cold ambition and perfumed venom. Hailing from a declining count's family, she viewed House Vance not as a home, but as a golden ladder. And when she gave birth to a second son, Julian Vance, just a year later, the battlefield within the Vance estate was officially drawn. To Elinor, Ethan Vance wasn't just a stepson. He was a giant, breathing obstacle standing directly in the way of her son, inheriting the massive wealth and military prestige of the Vance Duchy. For the next 8 years, Elinor waged a silent, insidious war against Ethan Vance. She never attacked him openly. Instead, she used the oldest aristocratic play in the book: psychological isolation and character assassination. Whenever noble guests visited the estate, Julian Vance was paraded around in custom-tailored silk, praised for the most basic accomplishments. If Julian Vance managed to cast a rudimentary spark spell, Elinor made sure the bards sang about it. Meanwhile, Elinor ensured that Ethan Vance was subtly excluded from high society banquets, kept out of the Duke's inner council meetings, and painted as a reclusive, talentless shut-in who preferred old dusty manuscripts over martial training. And how did Duke Patrick react to all of this? He ate it up. Patrick was a man obsessed with appearances. He wanted a flamboyant, flashy heir who stroked his ego, not a quiet son who reminded him of his deceased first wife. As the years dragged on, the Duke's gaze toward Ethan Vance shifted from mild disappointment to outright resentment. Ethan Vance saw through every single dirty trick. Inside his mental palace, the 100 conquerors scoffed at Alina's amateurish scheming. She poisons the father's ear with flattery while neglecting the household ledgers, an ancient chancellor sneered. A petty snake who thinks she rules the jungle because the tiger is resting, a ruthless warlord laughed. Ethan Vance could have easily dismantled Alina's plots within an afternoon. He could have exposed her embezzlement of the household treasury, manipulated the local lords, or ruined her reputation with 3 well-placed rumors. But Ethan Vance chose patience. He knew that open conflict inside the estate would only lead to a messy domestic squabble. He was waiting for his 18th birthday, the legal age of majority, where he could claim his mother's independent inheritance and walk away from this pathetic family for good. Unfortunately, Alina and Duke Patrick had other plans. They had no intention of letting the legitimate heir walk away alive to contest the succession later. On the morning of Ethan Vance's 18th birthday, the Great Hall of House Vance was decorated not with festive banners of celebration, but with the cold, heavy standard of the royal military. Duke Patrick sat upon the high seat, his face set in a practiced mask of solemn authority. Beside him, Alina smiled with eyes as sharp and cold as glass shards. Down on the lower cushions sat 17-year-old Julian Vance, wearing gilded decorative armor, smirking like a kid who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. "Ethan Vance," Duke Patrick's voice boomed across the marble hall, laced with false paternal gravity. "Today you become a man under the laws of Valerius. As the eldest son of House Vance, blood and honor demand that you prove your worth not through idle reading, but through service to the crown." Ethan Vance stood in the center of the hall, wearing simple black garments, his posture calm and relaxed. "And what service has my esteemed father arranged for me?" Duchess Alina leaned forward, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Oh, Ethan, your father has secured an extraordinary honor for you. The crown has issued a special mobilization decree for the northern border. You have been granted an official commission to lead our family's vanguard to the Frostbite Gorge. Think of the glory. When you return, the entire kingdom will recognize you as a true warrior of House Vance." Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the 100 conquerors erupted into cold, mocking laughter. Frostbite Gorge. It was the most infamous meat grinder on the entire continent. A frozen hellhole where the kingdom of Valerius fought an endless, bloody war of attrition against the savage, barbarian warbands of the northern tundra and mutated ice beasts. 9 out of every 10 noble sons sent to the Frostbite Gorge returned inside a lead-lined pine box. The one who survived usually came back missing 3 limbs and half his sanity. This wasn't a military commission, it was an execution. They were sending an 18-year-old boy with no official military record directly into the most lethal combat zone in the world. Also, they could legally claim he died a heroic death for the family, leaving Julian Vance as the undisputed sole heir to the duchy. Duke Patrick coughed into his fist, avoiding Ethan Vance's eyes. "The deployment leaves at dawn tomorrow. You will depart immediately. Do not disappoint the Vance name, Ethan." Young Julian Vance couldn't hold back a quiet snicker, leaning back in his velvet chair, looking at Ethan Vance as if he were already a corpse rotting under 6 feet of snow. Any ordinary teenager would have broken down in tears. They would have screamed at the injustice, begged their father for mercy, or exposed the stepmother's blatant betrayal. Instead, Ethan Vance slowly looked up. For the first time in 18 years, the dim, quiet light in Ethan Vance's eyes vanished. In its place burned a dark, predatory abyss, the collective gaze of 100 tyrants who had drowned worlds in blood. A sudden, suffocating chill swept through the grand hall. For a brief split second, Duke Patrick felt an instinctive, primal terror clutch his chest, like a rabbit suddenly realizing it was locked in a cage with a starved dragon. Alina's smile froze. Julian Vance nervously shifted in his seat, suddenly unable to breathe. "A vanguard commission at the northern Iron Wall," Ethan Vance said softly, his voice smooth and steady. "Understood, father. I accept the honor. I will make sure House Vance receives everything it truly deserves." Without bowing, Ethan Vance turned on his heel and walked out of the hall. The mask was off, the quiet boy was dead. If this pathetic family wanted to throw him into the meat grinder, they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their miserable lives. You do not throw a monster into hell. You only give him an army. 2 weeks later, the icy winds of the northern tundra howled like dying spirits against the jagged black cliffs of the Frostbite Gorge. The sky above was a permanent, suffocating gray, and the ground below was a frozen swamp of black mud, jagged ice, and half-frozen pools of dried blood. This was Outpost 9, the absolute frontline of the Northern Iron Wall, and Ethan Vance's glorious military commission. It turned out to be a draft notice to the 7th Penal Battalion, affectionately known among the soldiers as the Corpse Company. The unit consisted of 300 men, convicted murderers, disgraced thieves, desperate debtors, and political exiles. Their equipment consisted of chipped iron short swords, splintered wooden shields, and leather armor so thin it wouldn't stop a stiff breeze. Their commander was a scarred, one-eyed veteran named Captain Vane. Vane was a man who had survived 10 years on the Northern Wall purely because he viewed every new replacement as disposable meat to buy time for the regular army. When Ethan Vance walked into the command tent, wearing the battered gray uniform of the Penal Battalion, Vane didn't even look up from his tactical map. "Another noble brat," Vane spat onto the dirt floor. "Let me guess, you insulted the wrong duke's daughter or your stepmother wanted your inheritance. Well, listen up, boy. Out here your fancy family name isn't worth a warm bowl of piss. Out here you are fodder. When the war horns blow, your job is to stand in the trench, hold your spear, and scream loud enough so the archers behind you know where the enemy is charging." Vane looked up, expecting to see the boy trembling, pale, or begging for a transfer to the supply lines. Instead, Ethan Vance was quietly examining the tactical map on the table. His eyes scanned the contour lines of the gorge, the narrow choke points of the frozen river, the wind direction markers, and the deployment flags of the savage Bloodfang orc warbands encamped 3 miles north. Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the pantheon of conquerors was already calculating. "Look at their formation," a nomadic horse lord whispered in his mind. "Heavy shock cavalry on the flanks, but their center is weighed down by frost trolls, slow, predictable. A classic double-envelope trap would crush them in the canyon," a grand strategist added. "If the idiot commanding this fort had half a brain, this campaign would have been over 3 months ago." Ethan Vance looked at Captain Vane with an expression so calm it was unnerving. "Captain Vane," Ethan Vance said smoothly, "if your scouts reported that the Bloodfang vanguard is still gathering at the river bend, your scouts are already dead. The enemy vanguard crossed the frozen rapids 20 minutes ago. They'll be scaling our eastern trench within 10 minutes. Vane slammed his fist on the table, his one eye blazing with anger. "What the hell do you know, you arrogant little?" B-O-O-O-O-M. Before Vane could finish his sentence, the catastrophic blare of a northern war horn shattered the howling wind. Panic exploded outside the tent. Screams of terror echoed across the outpost as heavy war drums thundered in the distance. A panicked soldier threw open the tent flap, his face pale as a sheet. "Captain, the Bloodfangs, they bypassed the river watchtowers. Over 500 heavy berserkers are already storming the eastern palisade. The trench guards are getting slaughtered." Vane's face went completely white. 500! How did they get through the gorge without tripping the alarm flares? The outpost was completely unprepared. The soldiers were running in blind circles, dropping their weapons in panic. Captain Vane drew his broadsword, his hand visibly shaking. "Fall back to the second gate. Abandon the trenches. Form a perimeter and pray the main garrison sends reinforcements." "If you fall back to the second gate," a voice cut through the chaos like a razor, "the berserkers will bottle you inside the courtyard and burn the outpost to the ground with pitch oil. Nobody will survive to see the sunrise." Vane turned around. Ethan Vance had already picked up a heavy iron spear from the weapons rack. He stood at the entrance of the tent, the freezing northern gale whipping his black hair across his forehead. His posture was completely relaxed, but the aura radiating from his body was so heavy, so suffocatingly dominant, that every veteran soldier in the tent froze in their tracks. "What are you doing?" Vane yelled. Ethan Vance looked back over his shoulder, his lips curving into a cold, lethal smirk. "I'm taking command of this company," Ethan Vance said, his voice echoing with the undeniable authority of 100 sovereign kings. "Listen closely, men of the 7th. If you run back to the gate, you die as dogs in a cage. If you follow me, I will show you how to turn these 500 berserkers into a mountain of rotting meat." Before Vane could even scream treason, Ethan Vance turned and marched straight into the blood-soaked blizzard. The 5-year meat grinder had officially begun, and the kingdom of Valerius had just unleashed its greatest nightmare upon the world. If you've ever seen a cornered animal, you know it either runs away or bites blindly until it gets put down. When 500 blood-crazed Bloodfang berserkers came crashing through the frozen fog of Outpost 9, swinging massive spiked bone axes and roaring like starved demons, every single man in the 7th Penal Battalion thought they were already dead. These weren't ordinary soldiers. The Bloodfangs were 8-foot-tall northern brutes who coated their weapons in troll venom and felt no physical pain once their blood rage kicked in. Captain Vane was already scrambling toward the inner gate, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his broadsword. The convicts were dropping their rusted spears, trampling over each other in a desperate, pathetic scramble to escape the inevitable slaughter. In 5 minutes, Outpost 9 was supposed to become a smoking graveyard. Except Ethan Vance was standing in the middle of the courtyard. He didn't run, he didn't blink. His pulse didn't even accelerate by a single beat. Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the ethereal chamber of the 100 conquerors lit up like a command center. Look at their reckless momentum. An ancient general who had crushed barbarian hordes in the eastern steppes observed with a cool chuckle. They are charging blindly through the narrow ravine. They have 0 flank security, no rear guard, and their blood rage narrows their peripheral vision by 60%. "A classic inverted crescent formation," a master tactician added. "Funnel the apex into the kill zone, seal the choke point with fire, and butcher the center." Ethan Vance planted the butt of his iron spear into the frozen dirt with a deafening thud. "Form up on me?" Ethan Vance's voice didn't just carry over the howling blizzard. It possessed a supernatural, chest-crushing authority that rattled the very teeth of every convict in the yard. "First rank, interlock your wooden shields in a half-circle around the storehouse trench. Second rank, uncap the pitchhole barrels and soak the ravine floor. Third rank, archers, notch fire arrows and wait for my mark." The convicts froze. Under normal circumstances, hardened murderers and lifelong thieves wouldn't listen to an 18-year-old kid. But there was something in Ethan Vance's eyes, a terrifying, ancient abyss of pure, unapologetic violence, that made their primal instincts scream that disobeying him right now would be 10 times more lethal than facing the 500 berserkers. "Move, you worthless bastards," Captain Vane, snapping out of his stupor, roared in shock. "Do what he says if you want to see tomorrow." In less than 90 seconds, what was once a chaotic mob of terrified cowards transformed into a tight, locked defensive concave behind the storehouse ramparts. The Bloodfang berserkers burst through the splintered wooden gates like an avalanche of iron and muscle, their eyes glowing crimson with blood rage. Seeing a small group of human soldiers huddled in the center of the yard, the barbarian vanguard chieftain let out a mocking, guttural roar and led the entire 500-man charge straight into the narrow bottleneck between the supply barracks. Exactly where Ethan Vance wanted them. "Now," Ethan Vance said softly. 3 fire arrows streaked through the freezing night sky, plunging directly into the snow-covered barrels of pitch oil Ethan Vance had ordered spilled across the mud. WHOOOSH. A 30-foot wall of roaring orange flame detonated across the ravine, instantly severing the barbarian vanguard from their rear support. The sudden wall of fire didn't just trap over 200 berserkers inside the narrow kill zone. It blinded them, suffocating their blood rage in a blistering wave of smoke and searing heat. "Shields forward, staggered thrust," Ethan Vance commanded, stepping to the very front line. The penal battalion pushed forward behind their wooden barriers, their iron spears thrusting rhythmically through the gaps like the teeth of a giant meat grinder. And at the tip of the spear was Ethan Vance. For the first time in his life, Ethan Vance unleashed the martial mastery of the warlords within his soul. He didn't rely on flashy mana spells. He moved with the terrifying, economical precision of a reaper. His spear became a blur of silver lightning. Every single thrust pierced an eye socket, shattered a windpipe, or split a jugular vein. When the barbarian vanguard chieftain, a towering monster clad in mammoth hide, swung a 7-foot war axe down at Ethan Vance's skull, Ethan Vance didn't even bother dodging with wide movements. He simply tilted his head 2 inches to the left, allowing the massive blade to bury itself harmlessly into the frozen mud. Before the chieftain could even recover his balance, Ethan Vance stepped inside the brute's guard, drove the iron tip of his spear upward through the chieftain's chin, and ripped it through the roof of his skull in one clean, uninterrupted motion. The chieftain's colossal body collapsed into the dirt with a heavy thud. The courtyard went dead silent. The remaining berserkers, seeing their invincible leader decapitated in less than 2 seconds by a teenage boy, felt the icy grip of pure terror pierce through their blood rage. "They bleed just like dogs," Ethan Vance's voice cut through the burning smoke, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. "Do not leave a single one alive. Exterminate them." What followed wasn't a battle, it was an execution. When the morning sun crept over the jagged cliffs of the Frostbite Gorge, the Grand Commander of the Northern Iron Wall, General Barrows, arrived at Outpost 9 with 2,000 heavy cavalry reinforcements. General Barrows had ridden through the night, fully expecting to find a smoldering ruin filled with the mutilated corpses of the penal battalion. Instead, when General Barrows rode through the gates, his jaw nearly hit the frozen ground. The outpost was completely intact. In the center of the courtyard sat a neat, terrifying pyramid of 500 severed barbarian heads, meticulously stacked by military rank. And sitting on an overturned supply crate beside the mountain of skulls was Ethan Vance, calmly sipping hot tea while reviewing the garrison's supply manifests. Around him, the 300 convicts of the 7th Penal Battalion were standing at rigid, perfect military attention, their eyes locked onto Ethan Vance with the fanatical devotion of religious zealots. Captain Vane stumbled toward General Barrows, his eye wide with disbelief. "Gee, General, we didn't lose a single man, the boy." "No, Lord Ethan Vance. He butchered the entire warband in under 20 minutes. General Barrows, a 30-year veteran of the northern border, walked up to Ethan Vance, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "You're the eldest son of Duke Patrick Vance, the one they drafted to the penal company." Ethan Vance set his teacup down, his gaze meeting the general's without an ounce of deference. "I was, but as of last night, General, I am the commander of Outpost 9, unless you have an objection." General Barrows looked at the mountain of severed heads, then looked at the 300 convicts who looked ready to charge into the gates of hell if Ethan Vance gave the word. A slow, grim smile crossed the old general's scarred face. "No objections, Commander. In fact, I have 3 more contested valleys that need cleaning." That morning, Ethan Vance was officially granted independent field command of the 7th Battalion. And that was the moment the legend of the Ashen Ghost was born. Over the next 3 years, the Northern Front ceased to be a meat grinder for the Kingdom of Valerius. It became Ethan Vance's personal hunting ground. Ethan Vance didn't fight like the conventional Northern commanders, who relied on rigid phalanxes and slow, defensive attrition. Instead, Ethan Vance opened the mental vault of the 100 Conquerors and unleashed a symphony of war doctrines the continent had never witnessed before. When the Frost Troll clans entrenched themselves in the impassable Black Rock fortresses, Ethan Vance didn't waste a single man in a siege. He deployed scorched earth and hydraulic warfare, redirecting the thawing glacial river directly through their underground caverns, drowning their supply depots in freezing mud, and forcing 30,000 starving trolls to surrender without swinging a sword. When the nomadic winter wolf riders attempted lightning hit-and-run ambushes across the tundra, Ethan Vance introduced deep infiltration blitzkrieg. He outfitted his battalion in lightweight enchanted snowcloaks, marching 40 miles through blinding blizzards at night, striking the barbarian chieftains inside their own yurts while their warriors slept. He used psychological warfare with terrifying finesse. He would capture enemy scouts, feed them detailed, false tactical plans, and release them, only to execute an entirely different maneuver that caused barbarian warbands to turn on their own allied clans in paranoid bloodbaths. Within 36 months, the 7th Penal Battalion had expanded into a terrifying 10,000-man elite legion known across the kingdom as the Black Wolf Vanguard, or more colloquially, the Iron Ghost Legion. Every single soldier in that legion was a pardoned convict, an exile, or a discarded commoner who had been given new life, superior equipment, and unmatched glory by Ethan Vance. They didn't swear loyalty to the King of Valerius. They certainly didn't give a damn about Duke Patrick Vance. They answered exclusively to Ethan Vance. If Ethan Vance ordered them to burn the royal palace to the ground, they wouldn't ask why. They would only ask how much pitch oil to bring. By age 21, Ethan Vance had risen from a disposable penal fodder to the youngest Grand Vanguard Marshal in the kingdom's history, decorated with the Silver Eagle Medal of the Northern Command. Yet, while the entire kingdom's military hierarchy was celebrating the miraculous military genius defending the border, Ethan Vance's real masterstroke was happening hundreds of miles away from the battlefield. Because Ethan Vance knew an undeniable truth that every great scholar in his soul had carved into history. A kingdom is not conquered on the battlefield. It is conquered at the market stall and the banking ledger. Deep beneath the conquered northern tundra, Ethan Vance's scouts discovered something the incompetent barbarian chieftains had ignored for centuries: the largest unmined vein of glacial frost iron and high-grade mana ice crystals on the continent. Rather than reporting the discovery to the corrupt royal tax ministry in the capital, who would have simply pocketed the wealth, Ethan Vance secretly nationalized the mines under his personal military seal. He took the most brilliant, disgraced accountants and master forgers from his penal legion, placing them under the command of his most trusted shadow lieutenant, a former royal spy named Lieutenant Luke. Take 20,000 gold bars from the northern vaults. Ethan Vance instructed Lieutenant Luke inside his war tent on a freezing winter night. Go to the royal capital, buy up the failing merchant guilds, establish grain storehouses in every major province, and above all else establish a private lending bank. What shall we name the organization, my lord? Lieutenant Luke asked, bowing low. Ethan Vance's eyes glinted in the dim candlelight. The Black Lotus Consortium. Within 2 years, while Ethan Vance was painting the northern snow red with barbarian blood, the Black Lotus Consortium quietly metastasized across the kingdom of Valerius like an invisible spiderweb. They monopolized the kingdom's winter grain imports. They controlled the black market supply of high-grade military iron. And through their private lending vaults, operating under the guise of an elite foreign banking house, they began offering massive, low-collateral loans to greedy, over-leveraged nobles in the capital. And who was their very best, most enthusiastic customer? None other than Duchess Eleanor Vance. Back in the sun-drenched, luxurious gardens of the Vance capital estate, life couldn't have been sweeter for Duchess Eleanor and her beloved son, Julian Vance. For the past 3 years, Duchess Eleanor had been living in absolute bliss. Because Ethan Vance was deployed to the penal company, where official survival records were rarely updated, Duchess Eleanor and Duke Patrick had naturally assumed the boy had died in some frozen ditch during his first week of service. Duke Patrick had even held a quiet, private memorial service 2 years prior, conveniently removing Ethan Vance's name from the primary inheritance ledger and declaring 18-year-old Julian Vance as the official sole heir to House Vance. Sitting beneath a silk canopy, Duchess Eleanor sipped imported elven tea, watching her son Julian Vance swing a gilded rapier against a paid combat instructor. Julian Vance was now 20 years old, dressed in velvet doublets lined with ermine fur. He was handsome in a soft, pampered way, but his movements were sloppy, his breathing ragged after just 5 minutes of light sparring. "Magnificent Julian," Duchess Eleanor applauded with theatrical adoration. "With swordplay like that, the Royal Academy will have no choice but to award you the Golden Laurel Knight badge next month." Julian Vance sheathed his rapier, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief, his face smirking with unearned arrogance. "Of course, Mother, the instructors at the Capital Guild already know who I am, although securing the Master Instructor's personal endorsement for the High Knight exam requires a donation of 15,000 gold crowns." Duchess Eleanor didn't even flinch. Over the past 3 years, she had spent over 100,000 gold crowns buying Julian Vance fake knight tournament victories, bribing academy examiners, and funding lavish banquets to secure political backing from the capital's high-ranking counts. Duke Patrick had recently voiced mild concerns that the family's estate treasury was running alarmingly low due to recent poor iron harvests. But Duchess Elinor had effortlessly solved that problem. Just last month, a charming, exceptionally polite representative from the prestigious Black Lotus banking house had approached her salon, offering House Vance an open line of credit with virtually zero upfront collateral. All Duchess Elinor had to do was sign a few simple promissory notes, using House Vance's ancestral iron mines and rural estates as formal guarantees. "Do not worry about the gold, my sweet Julian," Duchess Elinor purred, patting her son's cheek. "The Black Lotus Bank has already approved our latest loan of 50,000 gold crowns. When you secure your Golden Knight badge, your father will formally announce your succession at the King's Autumn Jubilee. The entire Vance Duchy will belong to you. That dead wretch Ethan Vance isn't here to stand in your way anymore." Julian Vance laughed aloud, raising his goblet of spiced wine to the sky. "To my glorious future, mother. May my dear big brother rest comfortably under the northern ice." They clinked their glasses together, basking in their manufactured triumph, utterly drunk on illusions of grandeur. They had no idea that the Black Lotus Bank they were borrowing millions from was owned entirely by the very boy they thought was rotting in a ditch. They had no idea that every single promissory note Duchess Elinor signed was sitting neatly inside a locked iron chest on Ethan Vance's desk in the north. And most of all, they had no idea that the true nightmare of their lives wasn't dead. He was just finishing his warm-up. Year 4, the eve of the Great Winter. Ethan Vance stood atop the monumental stone ramparts of the northern iron wall, his heavy black fur cloak billowing in the freezing tempest. At his hip hung the legendary twin blades of the Ashen Vanguard, their steel forged from pure glacial frost iron. Beside him, Lieutenant Luke walked up, holding 2 sealed scrolls. "Report," Ethan Vance said, his eyes scanning the endless white horizon. "My lord," Lieutenant Luke began, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "The Black Lotus Consortium now holds 72% of House Vance's total debt. Duchess Elinor just took out another loan of 50,000 gold crowns to purchase honorary knighthood credentials for young Master Julian Vance." Ethan Vance chuckled softly, a quiet, dark sound that sent shivers down the spine of the guard standing 50 feet away. "She is taking the bait faster than I anticipated. Keep lending to her, Luke. Give her whatever she asks for. Let her build the highest golden tower she can imagine, because the higher she climbs, the more catastrophic the fall will be." Lieutenant Luke bowed. "Understood, my lord, and the second matter." Luke's expression turned dead serious. "Our northern scouts have confirmed it. The Grand Chieftain of the Northern Barbarians, King Bloodfang, has united all 24 barbarian clans. An army of 120,000 savage warriors is currently marching toward the Frostbite Gorge. They plan to break the Iron Wall and sack the kingdom of Valerius once and for all." Ethan Vance slowly placed his hand on the hilt of his frost blade. Inside his mind, the 100 conquerors didn't offer advice. They simply smiled. 120,000, Ethan Vance whispered, his eyes blazing with the golden fire of total, absolute slaughter. "Good. The king of Valerius has been sitting comfortably on his golden throne for too long, ignoring the northern border." Ethan Vance turned to Lieutenant Luke, his voice echoing across the battlements like thunder. "Sound the war horns of the Iron Ghost Legion. It is time to end this northern war once and for all, and claim our invitation back to the capital. There is a massive difference between a simple skirmish and a war of total annihilation. When you fight a skirmish, you're trying to take a hill, secure a supply cart, or capture a bridge. But when 120,000 bloodthirsty northern warriors march across the frozen tundra with the singular purpose of wiping your civilization off the map, all conventional rules of engagement go straight into the trash bin." The sky above the Frostbite Gorge had turned into an apocalyptic vortex of black snow and howling gale winds. Standing on the lower battlements of the northern Iron Wall, General Barrows and his senior commanders looked out into the blizzard, their faces drained of all color. As far as the eye could see, The white expanse of the tundra was completely blanketed in a sea of snarling barbarian infantry, armored mammoth war beasts, and towering frost giants carrying tree trunks as clubs. The rhythmic pounding of their war drums was so intense that vibrations could be felt through 30 feet of solid stone ramparts. "It's over," one of the aristocratic colonels whimpered, his knees visibly buckling beneath his polished armor. "We have barely 30,000 men stationed along the entire wall. We can't hold against 4-to-1 odds. We need to abandon the first wall and retreat to the interior provinces. If you take one step toward the retreat stairs," a voice as cold as absolute zero echoed from the command platform, "I will have your head mounted on the outer gate before your boot touches the second step." The colonel whipped around, ready to scream at whoever dared threaten a nobleman, only to choke on his own spit. Ethan Vance walked up the rampart steps, draped in a heavy cloak of midnight black wolf pelt. Behind him marched his 4 inner lieutenants, each wearing customized frost iron plate armor that radiated a faint, lethal azure glow. At 23 years old, Ethan Vance was no longer the slender, quiet boy who had been escorted out of the Vance estate in shame. He had grown tall, his shoulders broad and powerful, his jawline carved from granite, and his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 conquered battlefields. General Barrows stepped forward, saluting Ethan Vance with the utmost deference. "Grand Marshal Ethan Vance, the enemy has deployed in 5 massive siege columns. King Bloodfang himself is leading the central vanguard atop his colossal dread mammoth. How do you propose we hold the wall?" Ethan Vance looked over the parapet, his lips curling into that signature, terrifying smirk that made his own men grin and his enemies pray to whatever gods they had left. "Hold the wall?" Ethan Vance scoffed softly. "General Barrows, who said anything about holding the wall? Defensive sieges are for cowards with no imagination." General Barrows blinked in utter bewilderment. You don't intend to defend the fortress." "We are going to open the main gates," Ethan Vance said calmly, as if he were discussing the afternoon weather. "And we are going to invite them all to their own funeral." Inside Ethan Vance's mental palace, the 100 conquerors had already drafted the slaughter before the first barbarian horn even blew. This was the triple-fold death mandala, a legendary tactical doctrine used by an ancient Eastern emperor to obliterate a nomadic horde twice this size. When the massive iron gates of the northern wall groaned open, King Bloodfang, a 7'6" behemoth of scarred muscle wearing a crown of human finger bones, threw his head back and laughed. He assumed the southern cowards had lost their minds and were offering an unconditional surrender. King Bloodfang ordered all 80,000 warriors of his central vanguard to surge directly through the open gorge into the vast, ice-covered basin known as the Frozen Mirror Lake. It was a magnificent, thundering avalanche of muscle and iron. Tens of thousands of screaming berserkers charged onto the thick glacial ice, eager to be the first to breach the southern kingdom. And that was precisely when Ethan Vance sprang the first phase of the trap. Hidden in the jagged cliffs flanking the lake, 2,000 archers from Ethan Vance's Iron Ghost Legion unmasked massive, heavy-duty ballistas loaded not with standard iron bolts, but with alchemical thundercores purchased from the capital through the Black Lotus Consortium. "Release the sky," Ethan Vance commanded from the eastern ridge. Thump, thump, thump. 50 heavy alchemical bolts slammed directly into the seismic fault lines of the frozen lake bed. KBOM. The detonation didn't just shatter the ice, it triggered a catastrophic, cascading subterranean collapse. The 3-foot-thick glacial crust fractured into millions of jagged shards. In less than 40 seconds, over 30,000 heavy barbarian infantry and their mammoth war beasts were swallowed whole by the freezing, pitch-black abyss of the glacial lake, their heavy iron armor dragging them straight down into the watery grave. Panic exploded across the barbarian horde. The thundering momentum of 80,000 men instantly ground to a chaotic, screeching halt. Warriors were screaming, slipping into freezing fissures, and trampling their own comrades in a desperate bid to scramble back to solid ground. Now, Ethan Vance's voice resonated through the magical communication stones worn by his commanders. "Ghost Legion, execute the pincer." From the snow-covered pine forests on both flanks, 10,000 heavy shock cavalry of the Iron Ghost Legion erupted from the blizzard like vengeful wraiths. They didn't charge in loose packs. They moved in locked, impenetrable wedge formations, their frost-iron lances glowing with concentrated mana. They hit the disorganized, terrified barbarian flanks like a freight train made of pure razor blades. The sheer violence of the impact shattered the barbarian lines into fragmented pockets of isolated prey. Seeing his glorious invasion collapsing into a one-sided massacre in less than 15 minutes, King Bloodfang went completely berserk. Surging with Ninth Circle primal aura, the barbarian king leaped from his dying mammoth, swinging a 900-pound spiked bone mace that shattered 5 of Ethan Vance's cavalrymen with a single shockwave. "Ethanvnce," King Bloodfang roared, his voice shaking the very snow off the mountain peaks. "Face me, southern dog, or watch me rip your fortress apart with my bare hands." A shadow descended from the cliff above. Ethan Vance landed softly onto the blood-soaked ice 20 paces in front of the raging giant. He drew his twin frost blades, the pale blue steel humming with absolute, unadulterated lethal intent. "You've barked quite loudly for a man who walked 60 miles in the snow just to die on my doorstep," Ethan Vance said smoothly. King Bloodfang roared in fury, charging forward with speed that defied his colossal size. His massive mace swung horizontally, creating a sonic boom that tore a 20-foot trench through the frozen earth. Any normal knight would have been pulverized to red mist. Ethan Vance didn't even flinch. He didn't block, he didn't jump backward. Utilizing the ancient flowing silk movement of a legendary martial grandmaster, Ethan Vance leaned his torso beneath the howling mace by a fraction of a millimeter. The displaced air whipped his hair, but not a single hair was grazed. In the exact same fluid motion, Ethan Vance stepped onto the shaft of King Bloodfang's mace, using the giant's own momentum as a springboard. He launched himself into the air, spinning like a silver cyclone. "Shurararararark." The first frost blade severed King Bloodfang's right bicep tendon, completely deadening the giant's weapon arm. The second frost blade sliced clean through the giant's left knee, bringing the invincible king of the north crashing down onto both knees with a bone-jarring crash. King Bloodfang gasped in agony, looking up with wide, bloodshot eyes at the young man who had dismantled his entire life's work in 3 seconds. What kind of monster are you?" Ethan Vance landed lightly behind the kneeling king. He didn't offer a monologue. He didn't gloat. With a single, effortless backhanded slash, Ethan Vance's frost blade decapitated King Bloodfang, sending the crowned head spinning through the air before it landed neatly into the snow. Ethan Vance caught the severed head by its braided hair and held it high above the battlefield. "Your king is dead," Ethan Vance's voice boomed across the valley like the wrath of heaven itself. "Lay down your arms or be ground into the ice." Seeing the head of their invincible god king held aloft, the remaining 80,000 barbarian warriors collapsed to their knees, throwing their axes and spears into the red snow. The Northern War, which had bled the kingdom of Valerius dry for over 3 centuries, was officially, completely, and irrevocably over. Now, before we see how the royal palace and Ethan Vance's lovely, scheming stepfamily react to the news that their disposable family sacrifice just conquered an entire continent's worth of barbarian armies. If you are loving Ethan Vance's absolute masterclass in zero-to-hero strategic dominance, make sure to take a quick second to smash that like button. Leave a comment below sharing your favorite tactical moves so far, and hit subscribe to Fate Library with all notifications turned on. Your support is the fuel that keeps this library alive, and trust me, what Ethan Vance has planned for his corrupt family back in the capital is going to be 10 times more savage than anything he just did on this battlefield. So subscribe to Fate Library, grab your popcorn, and let's get right back to the destruction. 2 weeks later, the royal capital of Valerius was engulfed in a state of absolute, nail-biting hysteria. Rumors had leaked from the northern trade routes that King Bloodfang had mobilized over 100,000 warriors to breach the Frostbite Gorge. The aristocratic salons were in total chaos. Wealthy nobles were already packing their golden carriages, preparing to flee south to the coastal territories before the barbarian hordes reached the capital gates. Inside the grand throne room, King Valerius Roman III sat upon his golden throne, his brow furrowed with immense exhaustion. Around him, the High Chancellor and the Grand Council of Lords were engaged in a screaming match, pointing fingers and arguing over which province should be sacrificed as a buffer zone. Suddenly, the massive double doors of the throne room were slammed open with a thunderous crash. A royal courier, covered in dried mud, sweat, and frozen road dust, sprinted down the velvet red carpet, collapsing onto his knees before the throne with a golden scroll bearing the Grand Northern Seal. "Sire, emergency dispatch from the Northern Iron Wall," the courier gasped, barely able to draw breath. The entire court went dead silent. The Chancellor gripped his chest, terrified that the courier was about to announce the fall of the North. "Read it," King Valerius Roman III commanded, his voice trembling slightly. "Did the wall hold?" The courier unfurled the scroll, his hands shaking with sheer awe. "Sire, the northern wall did not merely hold. On the 15th day of the frost moon, Grand Marshal Ethan Vance engaged the united barbarian host of 120,000 warriors at the frozen Mirror Lake." The courier took a deep breath, his voice echoing across the palace. The barbarian army was completely routed. Over 35,000 enemy soldiers were neutralized in the opening hour. Grand Marshal Ethan Vance personally engaged and decapitated King Bloodfang in single combat. The remaining 85,000 warriors have formally signed the Treaty of Total Unconditional Surrender. What? The entire throne room erupted into pandemonium. Lords dropped their velvet hats. High-ranking dukes gasped in disbelief, grabbing each other by the shoulders. 120,000 rooted. He decapitated King Bloodfang alone. Wait, did he say Ethan Vance, as in Duke Patrick Vance's eldest son? King Valerius Roman III slowly stood up from his golden throne, a look of profound, ecstatic relief washing over his weathered face. "A miracle," the king breathed, before his voice swelled with royal majesty. "This is not merely a victory, this is the greatest military triumph in the 500-year history of our kingdom." The king slammed his royal scepter onto the marble floor. "By royal decree, Ethan Vance is hereby bestowed the supreme title of the kingdom's guardian dragon and the Grand Cross of the Sun. Prepare the Grand Triumph Arch at the Capitol gates. When Grand Marshal Ethan Vance returns, the entire kingdom shall bow in his honor." While the entire capital was exploding into deafening celebration, with church bells ringing and bards singing in the streets, an entirely different atmosphere hung over the opulent salon of House Vance. Duchess Elinor was sitting comfortably on her silk chaise lounge, delicately buttering a scone while watching her son Julian Vance admire his brand-new, gold-plated ceremonial armor in the full-length mirror. Duke Patrick was sitting at his mahogany desk, reviewing Julian Vance's fraudulent credentials for the upcoming Royal Knight exam with a proud, self-satisfied smile. "Everything is perfectly arranged, Patrick," Duchess Elinor purred, taking a delicate sip of tea. "With the Black Lotus Bank's latest loan, we've secured the full endorsement of the Knight Commander. At the King's Autumn Jubilee next week, Julian Vance will be officially knighted as the pride of House Vance. It's a pity Ethan Vance couldn't live to see his younger brother achieve such greatness." Julian Vance puffed out his chest, admiring his reflection. "Honestly, Mother, it's for the best. Ethan Vance never had the charisma to lead House Vance anyway. A weakling like him was always destined to be forgotten." Clang, clang, clang. Suddenly, the thunderous pealing of the great victory bells of the royal cathedral shattered the afternoon silence. Moments later, the galloping hoofbeats of the king's royal heralds echoed through the cobblestone streets outside the estate gates. A loud, booming royal voice, amplified by magic, rang through the entire noble district. Hear ye, by the grace of His Majesty King Valerius. Celebrate the triumph of the North. The 100-year barbarian war is won. All hail our Savior, Grand Marshal Ethan, the guardian dragon of Valerius. Smash! The porcelain teacup slipped from Duchess Elinor's fingers, shattering into 100 pieces across the Persian rug. Duke Patrick froze, his pen dropping from his hand, leaving a massive black blot of ink across Julian Vance's knighthood papers. Julian Vance's smug smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. What did the herald just say?" Duke Patrick stammered, his face turning an ash-gray color. Ethan Vance, Grand Marshal Ethan Vance. Duchess Alina gripped the arms of her silk chair so hard her knuckles turned white, her chest heaving as a cold, paralyzing terror gripped her heart. No, no, that's impossible. He was in the penal company. He was supposed to die 5 years ago. He's a corpse. H.E.S. supposed to be a corpse. Before anyone in the room could speak another word, the heavy wooden doors of the Vance estate courtyard were pushed open by a breathless head butler. My lord, my lady," the butler cried out, trembling from head to toe. "The northern vanguard has just entered the capital gates. 5,000 heavy cavalry of the Iron Ghost Legion are currently marching down the main avenue, and Lord Ethan Vance is leading them straight toward the royal palace." Outside the window, the distant, ground-shaking thud of 5,000 synchronized iron hooves could be heard, vibrating the very foundations of House Vance. The prodigal son had returned. Not as a beggar, not as a broken soldier. He had returned as a war god, holding the leash of the entire kingdom. And the time to settle the debt had finally arrived. There is an old saying among the conquerors of the ancient world: the loudest sound in a kingdom is not the roar of a cannon, but the footsteps of a victorious army marching into a corrupt capital. The morning sun had barely crested the golden spires of the royal capital of Valerius when the ground began to tremble. It started as a rhythmic, bass-heavy vibration that rattled the porcelain tea sets in the highest aristocratic mansions. Then came the sound of 5,000 iron-shod warhorses trotting in flawless, unyielding unison down the great royal highway. Over 300,000 citizens had packed the capital's central boulevard. Commoners, wealthy merchants, street urchins, and lower aristocrats were hanging out of 4-story tavern windows, showering the street in a continuous blizzard of red rose petals and gold confetti. And then the vanguard emerged through the great arch of triumph. The Iron Ghost Legion. 5,000 battle-hardened veterans marched in tight, 4-column formation. Their armor wasn't the polished, decorative silver favored by the pampered capital garrison. Theirs was dark, battle-scarred frost iron, etched with the jagged claw marks of northern beasts and barbarian blades. They carried tall kite shields bearing the roaring white wolf crest, and not a single soldier broke rank or glanced at the cheering crowds. The sheer, suffocating pressure radiating from these 5,000 veterans was so intense that the cheering crowds instinctively took a step back, holding their breath in primal awe. And leading this invincible column atop a massive, coal-black warhorse was Grand Marshal Ethan Vance. Ethan Vance wore a high-collared tunic of midnight silk, beneath a masterfully crafted chestplate of midnight blue frost iron. Across his broad shoulders rested his iconic white wolf pelt, and at his hip hung the twin blades that had severed the head of the barbarian king. His face was completely calm. He didn't wave to the crowd like a desperate politician. He didn't smirk with arrogance. He simply rode with the terrifying, unshakable poise of a monarch, inspecting his newly acquired province. Standing on the elevated VIP viewing terrace, outside the royal plaza, were the high-ranking noble families of the kingdom. And right in the front row, looking like 3 people who had just been escorted to the gallows, stood Duke Patrick Vance, Duchess Alina, and their beloved son, Julian Vance. Duke Patrick was sweating profusely, his hands trembling so hard inside his velvet gloves that he had to clasp them tightly behind his back. Beside him, Duchess Alina looked as if she were trying to swallow a mouthful of crushed glass, her face caked in heavy white powder to hide her sickly, pale complexion. And Julian Vance? Julian Vance had insisted on wearing his brand-new, gold-plated ceremonial armor to the parade to show off his noble martial prowess. But standing 50 feet away from Ethan Vance, whose armor had literally absorbed the blood of 30,000 slain enemies, Julian Vance looked like a pathetic, painted clown trying to imitate a real warrior. As Ethan Vance's warhorse approached the VIP terrace, his gaze slowly shifted upward. For a brief, agonizing 3 seconds, Ethan Vance's dark eyes locked directly onto Duke Patrick, Alina, and Julian Vance. He didn't glare, he didn't sneer. He looked at them with the exact same detached, emotionless expression a person gives to 3 stepping stones covered in dirt. That brief look sent an icy shockwave straight down Julian Vance's spine. The spoiled boy's legs turned to jelly, and he had to physically grab his mother's velvet sleeve to keep from collapsing in front of dozens of watching counts and barons. Duke Patrick opened his mouth, trying to offer a practiced, paternal smile, but the air caught in his throat. He realized in that instant that the boy he had thrown to the wolves 5 years ago was dead. In his place was a supreme predator that could snap the entire Vance family in half with a single flick of his wrist. Without pausing for even a fraction of a second, Ethan Vance rode past them toward the royal palace gates, leaving the Vance family drowning in their own suffocating dread. Inside the grand throne room of the royal palace of Valerius, over 500 high lords, foreign ambassadors, and royal ministers were gathered in absolute, reverent silence. When the heavy oak and gold doors swung open, Ethan Vance walked down the 70-yard royal carpet alone. His heavy boots clicked against the polished white marble with the steady cadence of a death clock. As he passed the rows of dukes and marquises, men who had previously looked down on him as an unremarkable extra, they instinctively bowed their heads, parting like the sea before a storm. Reaching the foot of the throne steps, Ethan Vance stopped and placed his right hand over his chest plate, offering a crisp, respectful military salute. Grand Marshal Ethan Vance reports to His Majesty King Valerius Roman III. The northern barbarian horde has been pacified. The frostbite gorge is secure. King Valerius Roman III rose from his golden throne, his eyes shining with profound admiration. Grand Marshal Ethan Vance, the king's voice boomed across the vault of the palace. For 300 years, the northern border has bled our treasury and swallowed the lives of our finest young men. In 5 short years, you turned an impossible meat grinder into our kingdom's greatest triumph. There is no metal in our armory that can adequately repay the debt this realm owes to you. The king descended the marble steps, holding a velvet cushion upon which rested the Grand Cross of the Sun, the highest military decoration in the realm, only awarded 3 times in 5 centuries, and a master-forged golden ceremonial broadsword bearing the royal crest. The king personally pinned the gleaming sun medal to Ethan Vance's chest plate and presented the golden sword. Along with these honors, King Valerius Roman III continued, addressing the entire court, we grant Grand Marshal Ethan Vance an annual royal stipend of 100,000 gold crowns, direct supreme command over the Northern Legion, and full royal authority over military inspection across all provincial borders. A wave of gasps rippled through the noble assembly. Supreme military inspection authority. That meant Ethan Vance possessed the legal power to inspect the private armies, iron stockpiles, and military ledgers of any noble house in the kingdom, including his own father's duchy. However, the king smiled warmly, a hero of your stature deserves more than titles and coin. Speak your mind, Ethan Vance. Is there any personal request you wish to place before this crown? Duke Patrick, standing in the front row of the noble section, felt his heart violently seize. Eleanor gripped her fan so tightly the ivory ribs cracked. They were terrified Ethan Vance was about to ask the king to strip Duke Patrick of his title on the spot for military treason. Ethan Vance looked at the king, his voice smooth, steady, and loud enough for every single noble in the room to hear. Your Majesty is most generous, Ethan Vance said with a calm smile. I desire no additional royal estates in the capital. The only request I place before the crown concerns the rightful lineage of my mother, the late Duchess Melissa. The king raised an eyebrow with deep interest. Speak. Under the ancient laws of Valerius, Ethan Vance stated with razor-sharp legal clarity, the eldest son born of the legitimate first wife retains irrevocable primary right of inheritance to his father's ducal seat, provided he has proven his capability to defend the realm. Because false rumors were spread during my deployment suggesting I had perished in the north, the inheritance registry of House Vance was improperly altered. Ethan Vance's eyes turned, slicing directly toward Duke Patrick like a poisoned blade. I simply request that His Majesty's royal scribe reaffirm my legal status as the sole, undisputed first heir to the Vance duchy, and that my father, Duke Patrick Vance, sign the royal ledger here today before the king and the High Council. A deadly, breathless silence fell over the throne room. It was a master class in political chess. Ethan Vance didn't attack his father with crude accusations of betrayal. Instead, he used the king's personal favor and the highest legal statutes of the kingdom to publicly trap Duke Patrick in broad daylight. King Valerius Roman III nodded immediately without a second thought. A completely just and reasonable request. The hero of our kingdom shall not be denied his rightful birthright by clerical errors. The king looked toward Duke Patrick, his voice hardening with royal command. Duke Patrick Vance, step forward and sign the royal succession ledger. Duke Patrick felt 500 pairs of aristocratic eyes burning into his face. His face was flushed crimson with humiliation. If he refused, he was directly defying a royal decree and publicly admitting that he had tried to disinherit the savior of the kingdom. Trembling like a disgraced dog, Patrick stumbled down the marble steps, taking the enchanted royal quill from the scribe's hands. With shaky, irregular strokes, Patrick signed his name beneath Ethan Vance's title, officially re-establishing Ethan Vance as the absolute primary heir of House Vance. Standing beside the scribe, Ethan Vance leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that only Patrick could hear. "Thank you, Father. You've just signed the death warrant of your beloved second son's future." Patrick shuddered, almost dropping the quill, looking into Ethan Vance's eyes with sheer, unadulterated terror. That evening, the grand iron gates of the Vance capital estate swung open under a heavy shroud of cold autumn mist. 200 elite, heavily armored soldiers of the Iron Ghost Legion rode into the cobblestone courtyard, establishing an impenetrable security perimeter around the entire perimeter. When Ethan Vance stepped down from his carriage, Duke Patrick, Duchess Elena, and Julian Vance were already standing on the front steps, flanked by 60 nervous household servants. Patrick forced a nervous, sweating smile onto his face, attempting to step forward with open arms like a loving patriarch. "Ethan, my boy, welcome home. You have no idea how much your mother and I worried about you during these 5 long years. We held a memorial only because the northern dispatches were so chaotic. To see you return as a grand marshal, it is the greatest joy of my life." The sheer, shameless audacity of the man was breathtaking. Ethan Vance didn't even stop walking. He strolled straight past his father's outstretched arms, brushing past him as if he were a ghost made of thin air. Patrick's arms hung awkwardly in the empty cold air, his face burning with deep, suffocating humiliation in front of all his household staff. Duchess Elena quickly stepped in front of Ethan Vance, her practiced aristocratic mask struggling to stay intact. "Ethan Vance, darling, you must be exhausted from your long journey. I have already ordered the servants to prepare the finest luxury guest suite in the eastern wing for you and your officers." "Guest suite?" Ethan Vance stopped, his voice cutting through her words like a frozen scalpel. He turned, looking down at Elena with eyes of bottomless contempt. "Duchess Elena, perhaps your memory is failing in your old age. I am not a guest in this house. I am the legitimate master of this bloodline." Ethan Vance pointed toward the magnificent, 3-story central pavilion situated in the heart of the estate gardens. "That pavilion belonged to my mother, Duchess Melissa. By tomorrow morning, I expect every single piece of your perfume bottles, your dresses, and your gaudy velvet furniture removed from that building. If I find a single speck of your belongings in my mother's chambers at sunrise, my soldiers will throw everything into the courtyard fountain and set it on fire." Julian Vance, unable to swallow his pampered pride any longer, stepped forward, his voice cracking with indignant fury. "Ethan Vance, how dare you speak to my mother like that? You may be a general on the border, but this is the Vance estate. Father is still the reigning duke, and you have no right to." "BOOM." Before Julian Vance could finish his sentence, Ethan Vance didn't even draw a blade. He simply released a microscopic fraction of the Ashen Warlord aura he had forged through 5 years of slaughtering hundreds of thousands of enemies. The invisible kinetic shockwave struck Julian Vance like a physical battering ram. Julian Vance was thrown backward 3 full yards, crashing violently against the marble fountain, his breath knocked completely out of his lungs. He lay in the cold water, gasping for air, trembling uncontrollably as his bladder nearly gave out from sheer, instinctive panic. "Julian," Elena shrieked, rushing to her son's side in the puddle. Ethan Vance didn't even look at the pathetic boy floundering in the fountain. He turned to his lieutenant, Lieutenant Luke, who was standing behind him with a small smile. "Post 50 sentries around the central pavilion. Anyone who enters without my personal token is to be treated as an enemy combatant and executed on the spot." "Understood, Grand Marshal." Lieutenant Luke bowed with iron discipline. Without another word, Ethan Vance walked into the central manor, leaving his broken, terrified family shivering in the dark courtyard. Midnight, the central pavilion of House Vance. The room was lit by a single, soft mana lamp. Ethan Vance sat behind a large mahogany desk, reviewing several thick leather-bound dossiers. A shadow detached itself from the balcony curtains. Lieutenant Luke stepped forward, placing a sealed golden lockbox onto the desk. "Report on the economic trap, Luke," Ethan Vance said, not looking up from his papers. Lieutenant Luke opened the lockbox, revealing a stack of 50 signed promissory notes, each stamped with the official wax seal of Duchess Alina and House Vance. "My lord, it is even better than we anticipated," Lieutenant Luke smiled coldly. "Over the past 3 years, Duchess Alina has borrowed a total of 480,000 gold crowns from the Black Lotus Bank." "And what did she spend nearly 500,000 gold crowns on?" Ethan Vance asked with a dark chuckle. 150,000 went into purchasing fraudulent night exam credentials, bribing academy examiners, and hiring corrupt mercenaries to take dives in unofficial duels to build Master Julian Vance's reputation, Lieutenant Luke explained. Another 200,000 was squandered on hosting extravagant political salons to bribe high society counts to support Julian Vance's succession. The remaining amount was used to buy luxury jewelry and imported elven carriages to maintain her facade of unlimited wealth. And the collateral she signed over: the deed to all 3 ancestral iron mines of House Vance, along with the taxation rights to the eastern fertile valleys, Lieutenant Luke said with sheer satisfaction. "If the Black Lotus Bank calls in the debt tomorrow morning, House Vance will be legally entirely bankrupt. They won't even have enough coin to pay their household maids." Ethan Vance leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "Calling in the debt now would be too quick, too merciful. A sudden execution is a gift. What I want is a slow, agonizing public dissection." Ethan Vance's eyes glinted with the cruel wisdom of 100 ancient dynastic chancellors. "When does the Royal Autumn Night Tournament begin?" "In exactly 5 days, my lord," Lieutenant Luke replied. "Duchess Alina has already paid a 30,000 gold bribe to the tournament organizer, Count Belmont, to rig the brackets. Master Julian Vance has been assigned 3 low-tier opponents who have been paid to surrender in the first round, guaranteeing him a spot in the grand finals before the king and the entire nobility." Ethan Vance let out a quiet, terrifying laugh that echoed through the candle-lit room. "Count Belmont, a corrupt parasite who also owes 80,000 gold crowns to the Black Lotus Bank, does he not?" "He does, my lord," Lieutenant Luke smiled. "Excellent," Ethan Vance said, his voice dripping with lethal anticipation. "Send a message to Count Belmont tonight. Tell him that if he wants his debt forgiven, he is to make a small, quiet adjustment to the tournament brackets on the morning of the finals." Ethan Vance picked up his golden pen, signing a single parchment on his desk. "Let my dear little brother Julian Vance climb to the very peak of his stolen glory in front of the king, the ambassadors, and the entire high society of the realm." Ethan Vance's eyes burned with cold, merciless fire. "Because in 5 days, I am going to strip that boy's pride down to the bare bone and shatter this family's reputation into unrecoverable dust. If you've ever watched a cornered snake, you know it doesn't suddenly become reasonable when it realizes it's outmatched. It just finds a darker corner, gathers its venom, and looks for an ankle to bite while your back is turned." Following the humiliating disaster in the Vance estate courtyard, where Ethan Vance had casually blown Julian Vance into a marble fountain with pure kinetic aura, the atmosphere inside the master manor had become completely toxic. In the dead of night, behind soundproofed velvet curtains, Duchess Alina was pacing back and forth across her bedchamber like a caged hyena. Duke Patrick sat on the edge of the 4-poster bed, holding a damp compress to his temples, groaning in sheer misery. "We are ruined, Alina," Patrick whimpered, his voice trembling. "Did you see the king's eyes in the throne room today? The king personally handed Ethan Vance the Grand Cross of the Sun. He forced me to sign the succession ledger in front of the entire High Council. If Ethan Vance discovers that we used the estate's iron revenues to fund Julian Vance's academy fees, he can have me dragged before the royal magistrate for criminal mismanagement." "Shut your cowardly mouth, Patrick," Elena snapped, her manicured nails digging into the mahogany vanity table. So what if the boy can swing a sword against mindless barbarian brutes? The battlefield is one thing, but the royal capital is an entirely different arena. Out in the mud, you win with brute force. In high society, you win with alliances, wealth, and aristocratic prestige. Elena stepped toward Patrick, her eyes flashing with desperate manic intensity. Ethan Vance has been away for 5 years. He has zero connections in the capital. He knows none of the high lords, none of the court ministers, and none of the great banking families. Our allies, Marquis Lawrence, Count Belmont, and the high ladies, Salon, control the social narrative of this entire city. When Julian Vance wins the Royal Autumn Night Tournament this week, the bards will paint Julian Vance as the refined, cultured jewel of House Vance, while Ethan Vance will be viewed as nothing more than a bloodthirsty northern barbarian who belongs in a barracks. Sitting in the velvet armchair in the corner of the room, Julian Vance clutched a bruised shoulder, his eyes burning with toxic, adolescent hatred. "Mother is right, father," Julian Vance sneered through clenched teeth. "Ethan Vance is just an uneducated brute. Count Belmont has already rigged my tournament brackets. My opponents in the preliminary rounds have all been paid 15,000 gold crowns, each, to take a dive in the second minute. In the finals, I will perform the high-tier Vance Sunset Blade art before the king and Princess Sylvia. When the entire kingdom sees me crowned as the Golden Knight of the realm, Ethan Vance's little Northern War medal won't mean a damn thing." Duke Patrick looked at his wife and second son, desperately wanting to believe their delusions. He swallowed his fear and nodded slowly. 5 days? We just need Julian Vance to win the tournament. Then we can rally our allies and push back. They truly believed they were orchestrating a brilliant political counterattack. They had no idea that their entire conversation was being transcribed word for word by a shadow operative hanging outside their balcony window. The next afternoon, in the bustling commercial district of the royal capital, there stood an unassuming, ultra-luxurious 3-story tea pavilion known as the Jade Pavilion. To the public, it was an exclusive sanctuary where wealthy merchants and foreign aristocrats paid absurd sums of gold to enjoy rare elven white tea and high-stakes games of tactical chess. In reality, the entire third floor was the continental nerve center of the Black Lotus Consortium. Ethan Vance sat at a massive round table crafted from obsidian, wearing a simple dark traveling cloak. Surrounding him were 12 of the consortium's highest-ranking shadow directors, former royal accountants, retired master assassins, and disgraced high court jurists whom Ethan Vance had saved from execution over the past 5 years. Lieutenant Luke laid out 3 thick, wax-sealed leather dossiers before Ethan Vance. "Report on Duchess Eleanor's political network, Luke," Ethan Vance instructed calmly, taking a sip of fragrant tea. "My lord," Lieutenant Luke began, pointing to the first dossier. "Eleanor's primary political sponsor in the capital is Marquis Lawrence, the Minister of Trade. For the past 2 years, Marquis Lawrence has been leveraging his position to secure Eleanor's social standing in exchange for secret shares in House Vance's northern iron mines." Ethan Vance chuckled softly. "And what does the Black Lotus hold on the esteemed Marquis Lawrence?" A wicked grin spread across Lieutenant Luke's face. "The Marquis is an uncontrollable gambling addict, my lord. Through our shell casinos in the lower port district, he has accumulated a personal debt of 620,000 gold crowns to the Black Lotus banking house. Furthermore, our shadow operatives have acquired the original shipping manifests, proving that Lawrence has been illegally smuggling unregistered monster cores through the southern sea gates to avoid royal tariffs. In other words," Ethan Vance summarized with razor-sharp clarity, "Marquis Lawrence's entire noble title, his family estate, and his very head are currently sitting in the palm of my hand." "Precisely, my lord," Lieutenant Luke replied. "And regarding Count Belmont, the chief organizer of the Royal Night Tournament, Belmont received 30,000 gold crowns from Eleanor to assign Master Julian Vance 3 fake opponents, all low-ranking hedge knights who agreed to stage theatrical defeats to make Julian Vance look like a martial genius." Ethan Vance's eyes glinted with the cruel amusement of 100 ancient dynastic conquerors who had dismantled corrupt empires from the inside out. "A staged tournament," Ethan Vance murmured softly. "How wonderfully pathetic. Contact Count Belmont tonight, Luke. Deliver a copy of his personal debt note and the smuggling manifests linking him to Marquis Lawrence. And our instructions for the tournament brackets, my lord. Ethan Vance leaned back in his obsidian chair, his lips curving into a cold, lethal smirk. Tell Count Belmont that if he wishes to keep his noble title and avoid being dragged to the royal gallows for high fraud, he is to execute a subtle, last-minute substitution in the championship brackets. Ethan Vance slid a dark iron token across the table. In the preliminary round, let Julian Vance have his fake, paid-off victories. Let the boy believe his glorious destiny is secured. Let Alina spend thousands of gold on celebratory champagne in the VIP boxes. But when Julian Vance steps into the arena for the grand finals before the king and the entire kingdom, Ethan Vance's voice dropped to a chilling, predatory whisper. Replace his final opponent with Commander Gareth, the undefeated vanguard champion of the Iron Ghost Legion. The 12 shadow directors in the room shuddered with dark, vindictive glee. Commander Gareth was a 7-foot-tall juggernaut who had personally cleaved through 40 barbarian champions in the northern snow. Putting pampered, perfume-scented Julian Vance in an enclosed arena against Gareth wasn't a duel. It was feeding a silk-wrapped poodle to a starved mountain tiger. Let the fool dance on the high wire, Ethan Vance commanded. The higher he climbs, the more spectacular the splat. 2 days before the tournament, the grand glass domes of the Royal Conservatory Palace were illuminated by thousands of floating monocrystal lanterns, casting a shimmering golden glow over the most lavish aristocratic gathering of the season. This was the pre-tournament autumn gala, hosted personally by the king's eldest daughter, Princess Sylvia, and attended by the highest nobility, foreign dignitaries, and celebrated war heroes. When Duchess Alina and Julian Vance stepped out of their gilded, 4-horse velvet carriage, Alina had her head held high. She wore a gown of shimmering emerald silk embroidered with diamond dust, and around her neck hung a colossal sapphire necklace, purchased, of course, with another 20,000 gold loan from the Black Lotus Bank. Beside her, Julian Vance strutted across the red carpet in custom-fitted white and gold ceremonial armor, his rapier hilt encrusted with rubies. He looked like an aristocratic prince stepping out of a romantic fairy tale, waving to the court maidens who whispered behind silk fans. "Remember, Julian Vance," Alina whispered behind her gilded fan, "tonight is about projecting absolute dominance. Charm the high lords, flatter Princess Sylvia. Remind everyone that House Vance's true future lies in our refined grace, not Ethan Vance's crude violence." Julian Vance smirked, tossing his golden curls. "Do not worry, mother. Tonight I will ensure Princess Sylvia forgets Ethan Vance's name entirely." They stepped into the grand ballroom, soaking in the orchestral music and the intoxicating scent of expensive perfume. For the first 20 minutes, Alina and Julian Vance were the center of attention among their circle of paid noble sycophants, boasting about Julian Vance's upcoming inevitable triumph at the tournament. And then the Grand Royal Herald stepped up to the marble balcony and blew the silver herald horn, announcing the arrival of His Excellency, the Supreme Grand Marshal of the Realm, the Guardian Dragon of Valerius, Ethan Vance. The entire ballroom went dead, suffocatingly silent. The orchestral violinists stopped mid-stroke. Wealthy dukes nearly dropped their champagne flutes. Every single head in the room, over 600 high aristocrats, turned in unison toward the grand double doors. Ethan Vance stepped into the hall. He wore no gaudy jewelry, no diamond dust, and no ridiculous gilded armor. He wore a crisp, tailored, double-breasted coat of midnight black velvet lined with deep crimson silk, fastened with silver wolf-head clasps. Across his broad chest pinned the radiant golden sun of the Grand Cross of the Sun. His posture was completely relaxed, yet the sheer, regal gravity he possessed, the aura of a man who had commanded 100,000-man armies and carved his will across continents, commanded the entire room in a fraction of a second. In less than 3 seconds, the crowd surrounding Alina and Julian Vance completely vanished. High-ranking dukes, veteran battle generals, foreign ambassadors from the Eastern Empire, and wealthy merchant guildmasters surged across the ballroom like a human tidal wave, desperately trying to get within 5 feet of Ethan Vance just to offer their congratulations and introduce their daughters. Grand Marshal Ethan Vance, A true honor to finally meet the savior of our kingdom. Lord Ethan Vance, our trade guild would be immensely honored to host a banquet in your honor. Marshal Vance, the northern campaign tactics you utilized at Mirror Lake are being studied as a masterclass in the Royal Academy. Eleanor and Julian Vance were left standing completely alone in the center of the floor, looking like two abandoned statues in the middle of a deserted courtyard. Eleanor's emerald face flushed a violent shade of crimson, her fan shaking so violently in her grip it threatened to snap. Julian Vance's jaw was clenched so tightly a vein bulged on his forehead. "Look at him," Julian Vance hissed in bitter, venomous envy. "He's acting like he owns the entire kingdom." At that moment, the crowd parted respectfully as a stunning young woman with cascading silver hair, piercing sapphire eyes, and a gown of royal azure velvet approached Ethan Vance. It was Princess Sylvia, the king's brilliant firstborn daughter and the undisputed leader of the kingdom's reformist political faction. "Grand Marshal Ethan Vance," Princess Sylvia greeted him with an elegant, genuine curtsy, a rare, radiant smile gracing her lips. "I must confess, the royal palace has not seen such magnificent energy in decades. Your return has breathed life back into these dusty halls." Ethan Vance bowed smoothly with the flawless, ancient etiquette of a grand imperial court scholar, a bow so perfectly measured that even the oldest, most pedantic etiquette masters in the room nodded in stunned approval. "Your Highness's words are far too kind," Ethan Vance replied, his voice rich and melodic. "To stand in the presence of the kingdom's most brilliant jewel is an honor that far outweighs any medal pinned to my chest." Princess Sylvia's cheeks flushed with a faint, charming blush. She had expected a gruff, monosyllabic border soldier. Instead, she was speaking to a man whose refined speech, piercing intellect, and magnetic charisma completely outclassed every prince in the royal court. Seeing Princess Sylvia, the woman Julian Vance had spent 3 years desperately trying to court, smiling and laughing warmly with Ethan Vance was the final straw. Julian Vance's pampered, fragile ego completely shattered. Driven by blind, drunken jealousy and fueled by 3 glasses of fortified wine, Julian Vance stormed across the ballroom, pushing past 2 counts to insert himself directly between Ethan Vance and the princess. "Your Highness," Julian Vance blurted out, forcing an arrogant, flamboyant bow that reeked of desperate desperation. "I see you have met my rustic elder brother. While we are all grateful for his service in the mud, I must warn your Highness that border soldiers rarely appreciate the finer arts of high society culture. For instance, this banquet features the legendary 150-year Elven Sundu vintage. I doubt Ethan Vance has ever tasted anything more refined than cheap northern grog." The surrounding nobles froze in absolute, second-hand embarrassment. Princess Sylvia's smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, aristocratic disgust at Julian Vance's blatant, unprovoked rudeness. Eleanor, watching from 50 feet away, gasped in horror, realizing her son had just walked straight into a social minefield. Ethan Vance, however, didn't get angry. He simply looked at the crystal glass of golden wine in Julian Vance's hand with a faint, amused smile. "The 150-year Elven Sundu vintage," Ethan Vance murmured softly. Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the memories of an ancient grand sommelier and imperial scholar from a forgotten elven empire chuckled in absolute mockery. "If you were truly educated in high vintage culture, Julian Vance," Ethan Vance's voice resonated effortlessly across the silent ballroom, "you would know that the elven sundew of the 150th cycle was harvested during the great solar eclipse of the Ethelgard forest. Because of the eclipse, the sundew grapes suffered a frost spore blight, resulting in an excess concentration of tartaric acid." Ethan Vance took an empty crystal glass from a passing servant's silver tray, casually holding it up to the mana lamp. "A true connoisseur would recognize that the wine in your hand is not the authentic 150-year vintage. The hue is too amber, the viscosity is artificially thickened with cane sugar, and the aroma carries the distinct sour note of cheap southern grape mash. In short, Julian Vance, you are proudly holding a 30 gold counterfeit that some back alley capital merchant sold you for 3,000 gold. Ethan Vance looked down at Julian Vance, his eyes brimming with effortless, humiliating pity. "Perhaps, little brother, before you attempt to educate the princess on high culture, you should learn how to read the bottom of a wine cork." PFFFFD Several young noblewomen in the crowd failed to suppress their giggles behind their silk fans. Veteran dukes chuckled quietly into their beards. Princess Sylvia let out a soft, melodic laugh, looking at Julian Vance as if he were an amusing circus clown. It appears the Grand Marshal's eye for detail extends far beyond the battlefield, Master Julian Vance. Julian Vance's face turned from red to purple, then to a sickly, humiliated white. He stood frozen in the center of the grand ballroom, his glass of fake wine shaking in his hand, feeling the mocking, pitying eyes of 600 high society aristocrats burning into his soul. He had tried to humiliate Ethan Vance. Instead, Ethan Vance had publicly stripped him of his dignity with a 5-second lecture on wine chemistry. Julian Vance dropped his crystal glass, the fake vintage shattering across the marble floor, and fled the ballroom in blind, weeping humiliation, with Alina frantically scurrying after him. Ethan Vance watched them leave, casually taking a sip of fresh spring water, his eyes cold and calm. The appetizer was finished, and in 3 days, at the Royal Autumn Tournament, the main course would finally be served. There is an undeniable psychological phenomenon in human history. The more insecure a person is about their own mediocrity, the more desperate they are to construct a golden stage to prove they're a god. In the 48 hours following the disastrous gala at the Royal Conservatory, where Julian Vance had been publicly dismantled in front of 600 nobles over a glass of fake wine, the young heir apparent had completely lost whatever remained of his sanity. Inside the private training courtyard of the Vance estate, Julian Vance was hacking away at wooden straw dummies like a rabid animal, his breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. "I will kill him," Julian Vance snarled, his eyes bloodshot, his face drenched in sweat. "At the tournament, I will butcher my opponents so quickly the bards will have no choice but to sing my name. The king will see, Princess Sylvia will see. They will realize that Ethan Vance is nothing but a dirty, illiterate butcher, and I am the true son of House Vance." Watching from the stone terrace, Duchess Alina didn't stop him. In fact, her heart was burning with the exact same frantic, wounded vanity. "Do not worry, my sweet boy," Alina purred, stepping down the stairs holding a small, velvet-lined mahogany box. "I have already visited Count Belmont's manor in secret. The preliminary brackets are locked down tighter than the royal treasury. Your first 3 opponents have been paid 15,000 gold crowns each. They will dance for 90 seconds to make your footwork look breathtaking, and then they will take a dive straight into the sand." Alina opened the mahogany box, revealing a small crystal vial containing a swirling, luminescent crimson liquid. "And just in case your mana output wavers," Alina whispered with a dark smile, "our trusted merchant from the Golden Sun Pharmacy delivered this. It is the elixir of the Crimson Dawn, a high-tier combat stimulant that temporarily supercharges your mana core by 2 full circles for 30 minutes. You will feel no fatigue, your blade's speed will double, and you will look like an untouchable martial god." Julian Vance snatched the crystal vial, his eyes gleaming with sick, desperate euphoria. "With this, nobody in the capital can stand against me." What Alina and Julian Vance did not know, and what their pathetic, pampered minds could never conceive, was that the Golden Sun Pharmacy was a shell corporation owned entirely by the Black Lotus Consortium. And that elixir of the Crimson Dawn, it was indeed a potent mana stimulant, but it was an unstable military batch. It possessed a very specific, deliberate side effect. After 20 minutes of heightened euphoria, the user's mana circuits would violently overheat, triggering uncontrollable muscle spasms, severe vomiting, and temporary loss of bowel control. Ethan Vance hadn't just prepared a defeat for his brother. He had engineered the single most catastrophic, career-ending public humiliation in the 500-year history of the kingdom's chivalric tradition. The morning of the Royal Autumn Night Tournament arrived under a crystal-clear, sun-drenched autumn sky. The Colosseum of the Sun, the kingdom's colossal amphitheater of white marble, was packed to absolute maximum capacity with over 45,000 screaming spectators. Commoners packed the upper stone tiers, waving colored flags and chugging cold ale, while the lower velvet-lined loges were filled with the wealthiest aristocrats, high clergy, and foreign ambassadors from across the continent. At the highest center of the amphitheater sat the magnificent royal box. King Valerius Roman III sat upon his elevated throne, flanked by his royal guards and his eldest daughter, Princess Sylvia. And seated directly to the right of the king, in the place of highest military honor, sat Grand Marshal Ethan Vance. Ethan Vance wore his pristine midnight black uniform, his grand cross of the sun catching the morning rays with blinding radiance. Beside him, Princess Sylvia occasionally leaned over, whispering observations about the tournament with a bright, engaged smile that sent waves of bitter envy through the young noblemen seated in the lower boxes. Directly across the arena, in the prestigious ducal box of House Vance, sat Duke Patrick and Duchess Elinor. Patrick wore his most extravagant ceremonial ermine mantle, puffing out his chest and attempting to look like a proud patriarch. Elinor was draped in gold lace, holding a crystal glass of imported champagne, loudly boasting to the surrounding countesses about how Julian Vance had spent years mastering the secret sword arts of the Vance lineage. "Just watch, Countess Vania," Elinor smiled smugly, fanning herself with white peacock feathers. "My Julian Vance's blade is like silk dancing on water. You shall see what true aristocratic swordsmanship looks like today." Tia-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra, tia-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra, trumpets. The golden herald horns blasted across the arena, silencing 45,000 people in an instant. The Grand Herald's voice, amplified by massive sound amplification monocrystals, boomed across the Colosseum. "Ladies and gentlemen of VALERIUS, welcome to the semifinals of the Autumn Royal Night Tournament. Entering the arena, the shining hope of House Vance, the master of the Sunset Blade, Master Julian Vance." The southern iron gate groaned open, and Julian Vance strode into the arena like a conquering emperor. He had taken a full dose of the Crimson Dawn elixir 20 minutes prior. His skin was flushed with a vibrant, glowing energy, his eyes shimmering with concentrated mana. Dressed in his custom-fitted, polished gold and white plate armor, his ruby-hilted rapier gleaming in the sun, he threw his arms wide to the crowd, soaking in the thunderous roar of 40,000 spectators. Julian Vance looked up toward the royal box. Seeing Ethan Vance sitting right beside Princess Sylvia, Julian Vance's lips twisted into an arrogant, venomous smirk. He raised his rapier, pointing the tip directly toward the royal box in a flamboyant, theatrical challenge that made the commoners scream in excitement. In the first semi-final match, Julian Vance faced a low-ranking hedge knight from the southern provinces. The match was a complete, scripted circus. The hedge knight swung his broadsword with exaggerated, slow-motion swings, allowing Julian Vance to execute flashy, twirling spins and theatrical parries that looked incredible to the untrained eye. After exactly 90 seconds of choreographed dancing, Julian Vance delivered a light tap to the knight's breastplate, and the man theatricality flew backward onto the sand, dramatically throwing his hands up in surrender. "Victory to Master Julian Vance," the herald bellowed. The Colosseum erupted into wild applause. Down on the sand, Julian Vance sheathed his rapier with a flashy flourish, blowing kisses to the maidens in the front rows, raising his fists to the sky as if he had just single-handedly slain a dragon. In the ducal box, Duchess Elinor sprang to her feet, applauding with manic ecstasy, loudly proclaiming to everyone within earshot, "Did you see that? Flawless technique, unmatched grace, the Golden Knight of House Vance." Duke Patrick beamed with immense, unearned pride, raising his champagne glass to the neighboring lords, completely convinced that their family's prestige was finally saved. Up in the royal box, King Valerius Roman III politely clapped a few times, though his weathered eyes carried a faint trace of skepticism. The king had seen real combat in his youth, and Julian Vance's flashy dancing reeked of parlor tricks. The king turned to Ethan Vance with an amused smile. "Grand Marshal Ethan Vance, what is your professional assessment of your brother's swordsmanship?" Ethan Vance took a slow sip of cold water, his expression completely flat. "With all due respect to the entertainment value, Your Majesty," Ethan Vance said smoothly, loud enough for Princess Sylvia and the surrounding royal ministers to hear, "that was not swordsmanship. That was a badly rehearsed theatrical play. If my brother stepped onto a real battlefield with that posture, a northern goblin would have his lungs hanging from a tree branch in under 4 seconds." Princess Sylvia let out a soft snicker, quickly covering her mouth with her delicate hand, while the veteran Royal Knight commander standing behind the king gave a solemn, appreciative nod. 30 minutes later, the afternoon sun hung directly over the center of the Colosseum of the Sun. Julian Vance stood in the center of the sand, having drank a second secret vial of the Crimson Dawn elixir in the prep room to ensure his mana output stayed at its absolute peak. His veins were now visibly pulsing with dark red mana beneath his skin. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a war drum. He felt invincible. He felt like an immortal god walking among mortals. Across the arena, the northern iron gates began to grind open with a heavy, ominous groan. The Grand Herald stepped to the center platform, unfurling a thick parchment scroll, his voice echoing across 45,000 people. Citizens of the realm, we have reached the Grand Championship Finals, competing for the coveted title of Royal Sun Knight and a personal commission in the Royal Guards, introducing the finalist from the Northern Division. In the ducal box, Elinor leaned forward with a confident, victorious smile, expecting the herald to announce the name of the second paid-off hedge knight Count Belmont had promised. Representing the supreme vanguard of the Northern Iron Wall, the terror of the Frostbite Gorge, Commander Gareth the Crusher. Clang! Duchess Elinor's smile instantly froze. The champagne glass in Duke Patrick's hand stopped midair. Down in the prep tunnel, Count Belmont slipped out of the arena through a rear service exit, his face pale as death, fleeing toward the Capitol gates with his bags already packed. From the dark archway of the northern gate emerged a walking mountain of sheer, unadulterated violence. Commander Gareth. Standing 7 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders as wide as a castle gate, Gareth wore no polished, decorative gold. He wore heavy, blood-stained, frost-iron armor that had absorbed the blows of barbarian chieftains and frost trolls. Across his massive, scarred neck hung a necklace of monster fangs, and in his right hand he casually dragged a 9-foot-long, two-handed executioner's greatsword across the arena floor. The heavy blade carved a deep, sparking trench through the white marble threshold, producing a horrifying, screeching sound that instantly silenced 45,000 cheering spectators. The entire Colosseum went dead, suffocatingly quiet. The atmosphere shifted from a festive, noble sporting event to the grim, terrifying entrance of an ancient executioner. Down on the sand, Julian Vance's euphoric, drug-induced confidence instantly evaporated like a puddle of water thrown into a volcano. His knees began to violently tremble inside his gold-plated greaves. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a silk suit. What is this?" Julian Vance stammered, looking frantically up at the referee boxes. "This is a mistake. Where is Sir Thomas? This isn't the bracket." "There are no mistakes in the King's arena, boy." Commander Gareth's voice rumbled like an earthquake, his single visible eye looking down at Julian Vance with the cold, bored gaze of a butcher inspecting a slab of pork. "The Grand Marshal ordered me to give you a proper northern greeting. Draw your toothpick." In the ducal box, Duchess Elinor sprang to her feet, screaming in shrill, hysterical panic. "Stop the match! This is an outrage! That man is a brute! He is not a registered Academy Knight." Up in the royal box, King Valerius Roman III raised his royal hand, silencing Elinor's shrieks with absolute sovereign authority. "Commander Gareth is an officially decorated officer of the Royal Northern Vanguard," the king declared firmly. "He has passed all registration criteria. The championship match shall proceed." The king glanced at Ethan Vance with deep, knowing intrigue. Ethan Vance simply leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into that dark, lethal smirk. The referee raised his white flag, his own hand shaking with anxiety. "Contestants, begin." Driven by sheer, cornered terror and the surging chemical madness of the double-dosed Crimson Dawn elixir, Julian Vance let out a high-pitched, desperate shriek. "Die, you filthy peasant!" Julian Vance surged forward, his body enveloped in an erratic, crackling aura of unstable crimson mana. He thrust his ruby-hilted rapier straight toward Gareth's unarmored throat with all the speed and desperation his body could muster. It was, objectively speaking, the fastest, most powerful thrust Julian Vance had ever produced in his entire pampered life. Commander Gareth didn't even bother raising his greatsword to block. He simply took half a step to the left. The rapier grazed harmlessly past Gareth's iron pauldron. Before Julian Vance could even register that he had missed, Gareth's massive, gauntleted left hand shot forward like an iron bear trap, locking directly around Julian Vance's throat. Choke! Julian Vance's forward momentum was violently arrested midair. Gareth lifted the 20-year-old noble completely off the ground with one arm, dangling him like a squealing piglet. "Is this the Sunset Blade?" Gareth rumbled with deep disgust. "A 5-year-old barbarian girl swings a wooden branch with more backbone." "Gak, let me. Go." Julian Vance wheezed, his legs kicking uselessly in the air, his golden rapier clattering harmlessly into the sand. Up in the stands, 45,000 people watched in stunned, dead silence. The golden prodigy of House Vance was being held up by one hand like a piece of dirty laundry. And that was precisely when the second phase of Ethan Vance's trap detonated. The 20-minute threshold of the double-dosed Crimson Dawn elixir expired. The sudden chemical crash hit Julian Vance's nervous system like a runaway freight train. His mana circuits violently backfired, sending searing, agonized spasms through his internal organs. Blallalalalalalalegh. Right there, suspended 5 feet in the air before the king, Princess Sylvia, 45,000 commoners, and every noble house in the realm. Julian Vance violently projectile vomited all over his own golden breastplate and Commander Gareth's boots. And then his sphincter completely gave out. A loud, wet, unmistakable squelch echoed across the silent arena floor, followed instantly by a foul, rancid stench that wafted up into the front rows of the noble boxes. A dark, brown stain rapidly spread across the crotch of Julian Vance's pristine white silk trousers, dripping down into his gilded boots. Gareth let out a roar of pure disgust, dropping Julian Vance into the dirt like a bag of manure. "Disgusting little pig," Gareth spat, wiping his boot in the sand. Julian Vance lay in the center of the arena, covered in his own vomit and excrement, weeping hysterically, curling into a pathetic fetal position as his body convulsed in drug-induced spasms. The entire Colosseum of the Sun sat in absolute, horrified, paralyzed shock for 5 full seconds. And then the laughter began. It started with a single snicker from the upper commoner bleachers. Then a group of soldiers laughed. Within 10 seconds, 45,000 spectators erupted into a deafening, earth-shaking roar of uncontrollable, mocking laughter. Commoners were holding their bellies, howling with tears streaming down their faces. Young noble ladies were gagging into their silk handkerchiefs, turning their heads away in utter revulsion. Foreign ambassadors were laughing into their sleeves, pointing at the Vance family crest. In the ducal box, Duchess Eleanor's eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed into her chair in a dead, humiliating faint. Duke Patrick Vance buried his face in his hands, trembling with such profound, soul-crushing shame that he wished the arena floor would swallow him alive. The Vance family name, built on 5 centuries of aristocratic pride, had just been dragged through literal feces in front of the entire kingdom. Up in the royal box, Ethan Vance slowly stood up. He didn't laugh, he didn't mock. He simply looked down at the weeping, soiled heap of meat. That was his brother with the cold, absolute finality of an executioner who had just dropped the blade. Ethan Vance turned to Princess Sylvia and the king, offering a polite, respectful bow. "It appears my brother's martial demonstration is concluded, Your Majesty. If you will excuse me, I have a family estate to repossess." Without looking back, Ethan Vance turned and walked out of the royal box. The stage of the fool was destroyed, and now the final, total bankruptcy of House Vance was about to begin. If you've ever wanted to witness the complete, instantaneous evaporation of 5 centuries of aristocratic pride, all you had to do was walk through the streets of the royal capital the morning after the autumn night tournament. By sunrise, Julian Vance's spectacular, drug-induced disaster in the arena had become the #1 topic of conversation across the entire kingdom. Tavern bards had already composed 3 different satirical comedy songs about the golden-soiled night of House Vance. Street merchants were selling miniature toy knights in stained white trousers for 2 copper coins. High society ladies who had previously attended Eleanor's tea salons suddenly developed severe cases of social amnesia, burning their invitation cards and claiming they had never met the woman in their lives. Inside the Vance capital estate, the atmosphere was like a funeral parlor after a plague outbreak. The grand iron gates were bolted shut from the inside to keep away mocking commoners and relentless street reporters. Over half the household servants had already packed their bags and fled in the night, terrified of being associated with the disgraced family. Up on the second floor, Julian Vance was locked inside his bedchamber in a catatonic, weeping stupor. He was curled up under his blankets, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, his mind completely broken by the memory of 45,000 people howling with laughter at his soiled trousers. Down in the master study, Duke Patrick Vance was having an absolute screaming breakdown. "You ruined US," Patrick roared, slamming a crystal decanter against the marble fireplace, sending glass and red wine splashing across the wallpaper. "You and your stupid elixirs, you and your rigged brackets." The king looked at me yesterday with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Every single duke on the High Council is laughing behind my back. 500 years of the Vance name, dragged through literal shit by your spoiled bastard." Duchess Alina was sitting in the corner armchair, her face pale, her hair disheveled, her makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. Yet even in the depths of total ruin, her venomous, delusional arrogance refused to die. "Shut up, Patrick," Alina shrieked back, her voice raw and cracked. "It was just an unfortunate alchemical reaction. Julian Vance was poisoned by a rival house. We can still salvage this. Marquis Lawrence, the Minister of Trade, he owes me his political support. I will go to the Ministry of Trade right now. He will use his royal authority to ban the bards, censor the printing presses, and restore Julian Vance's honor." Alina grabbed her velvet cloak, determined to run to her ultimate political savior. She had no idea that at that exact second, Marquis Lawrence was already on his knees, staring into the cold, merciless eyes of the Reaper. 30 minutes earlier, the opulent, gilded mansion of Marquis Lawrence, the Minister of Trade, was surrounded by 80 heavily armored soldiers of the Iron Ghost Legion. Inside the Marquis's private study, furniture was overturned, secret wall safes were cracked open, and stacks of forged ledgers were being systematically catalogued by shadow operatives of the Black Lotus Consortium. Marquis Lawrence, a portly, 60-year-old nobleman in silk robes, was pinned to the floor by the heavy iron boot of Commander Gareth. Sitting casually at Lawrence's mahogany desk, reviewing a thick stack of parchment, was Grand Marshal Ethan Vance. "Lord Ethan Vance," Lawrence gasped, his face pressed against the Persian rug, terror squeaking in his voice. "This is an outrage. I am a minister of the Crown. You have no legal authority to raid a cabinet minister's private residence without a warrant from the High Chancellor." Ethan Vance didn't even look up from his papers. He took a slow, deliberate sip of hot tea before tossing 3 leather-bound ledgers onto the floor right in front of Lawrence's nose. "A royal warrant?" Ethan Vance murmured, his voice calm and melodic. "Marquis Lawrence, do you truly wish for me to involve the High Chancellor? Because if I do, I will also have to hand him these 3 ledgers." Ethan Vance pointed with his silver fountain pen. "The first ledger details your personal gambling debt of 620,000 gold crowns to the Black Lotus gaming vaults. The second ledger contains the signed shipping manifests proving that you've been smuggling illegal high-tier monster cores through the southern sea gates for the past 4 years to avoid paying royal tariffs." Ethan Vance leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto Lawrence's terrified face with the crushing weight of an executioner. "And the third ledger is a direct record of your treasonous conspiracy with Duchess Alina to illegally sell shares of the kingdom's strategic northern iron mines to foreign syndicates." Lawrence felt the blood drain completely from his body. His heart felt as if it had been submerged in liquid ice. Those 3 ledgers didn't just mean political disgrace. They meant public execution on the Grand Royal Guillotine, the total confiscation of his family's estates, and his entire bloodline being sold into perpetual penal servitude. "How?" Lawrence stammered, tears of sheer panic flooding his eyes. "How do you have these ledgers? The Black Lotus Bank promised these records were locked in their sovereign vaults." Ethan Vance chuckled softly, a quiet, chilling sound that echoed through the ransacked room. "Marquis Lawrence, who do you think owns the Black Lotus Bank?" Lawrence stared at Ethan Vance in absolute mind-shattering horror. The pieces violently snapped together in the old minister's mind. The mysterious, all-powerful foreign banking syndicate that had appeared out of nowhere 3 years ago. The bank that had loaned millions of gold to every corrupt noble in the capital. The bank that held the financial noose around the entire government. It was Ethan Vance all along. "Why you?" Lawrence whimpered, trembling so violently his teeth were clattering. "You're the master of the Black Lotus." Ethan Vance stood up, straightening his midnight black uniform coat. "You have exactly two choices, Lawrence. Option 1, I hand these ledgers to the royal magistrate in 10 minutes. By sunset, your head will be on a spike above the Capitol gates, and your family will be chained in the iron mines." Ethan Vance tossed a blank, stamped confession scroll onto the desk. "Option 2, you sign this full confession detailing all of Duchess Aliner's financial embezzlements and forged documents. You will resign from the Ministry of Trade, and you will transfer all your remaining assets to the Black Lotus Consortium as debt settlement. In exchange, I let you live in quiet exile in a small countryside village." Ethan Vance looked down at the shivering minister with absolute sovereign finality. "You have 5 seconds to choose." Lawrence didn't even hesitate for half a second. He scrambled forward like a starving dog, grabbed the quill, and signed his name to the total confession with trembling, desperate strokes. Ethan Vance picked up the signed parchment, blowing on the wet ink with a satisfied smile. "Good dog," Ethan Vance said softly. "Commander Gareth, escort the former minister to the city gates and tell Lieutenant Luke it is time to collect the grand debt at House Vance." 2 hours later, the iron gates of the Vance capital estate were rattled by a series of heavy, thunderous bangs. Boom, boom, boom. Before the frightened gatekeepers could even ask for identification, the heavy iron chains were sheared in half by 4 massive hydraulic bolt cutters. A convoy of 6 pitch-black, armored carriages bearing the menacing gold and obsidian emblem of the Black Lotus banking house rolled straight into the estate courtyard. Flanked by 30 heavily armed dead enforcers wearing enchanted black plate armor. The head butler sprinted into the master's study, his face as white as a sheet. My lord, Duchess Aliner, the Black Lotus Bank has arrived. They've breached the courtyard gates with official royal repo warrants." Duke Patrick and Duchess Aliner rushed down the grand marble staircase into the main reception hall, their hearts pounding in their throats. Standing in the center of the hall, flanked by 2 towering dead enforcers holding enchanted iron ledger boxes, was Lieutenant Luke, dressed in the immaculate, high-collared velvet suit of the chief executive of the Black Lotus Consortium. Duchess Aliner forced an arrogant, aristocratic scowl onto her face, trying desperately to project authority. "What is the meaning of this insolence?" Aliner barked, pointing a trembling finger at Luke. "Breaking my estate gates? I am Duchess Aliner Vance. Your bank is supposed to be a discreet, professional lending institution. I demand you withdraw your armed guards immediately." Luke didn't flinch. In fact, he looked at Aliner with the cold, amused pity of a banker looking at a bankrupt beggar screaming at a vault door. "Duchess Aliner Vance," Luke's voice rang across the grand hall with crisp legal precision. "As of noon today, your primary political guarantor, former Minister Marquis Lawrence, has been stripped of his office and assets due to high financial fraud. Under Section 14 of your signed loan agreements, the loss of your primary guarantor triggers an immediate, mandatory acceleration clause on all outstanding debts." Luke opened the iron lockbox, pulling out a thick, terrifying stack of 50 wax-sealed promissory notes. Between personal loans, luxury line of credits, academy bribe funds, and tournament collateral fees, House Vance currently owes the Black Lotus banking house a grand total of 684,000 gold crowns. "What?" Duke Patrick staggered backward, gripping the banister to keep from collapsing. 684,000 gold crowns? Aliner, what in the gods' name have you done?" That's impossible," Aliner screamed in sheer hysterics. "I only borrowed 400,000. The interest rate cannot be that high. Compounded weekly at 12% for high-risk unsecured borrowing, exactly as you signed with your personal seal on every single one of these 50 documents, Duchess." Luke smiled politely. "The Black Lotus Bank hereby demands full, immediate settlement of the entire 684,000 gold crowns. You have 24 hours to produce the coin. 24 hours, Patrick shrieked, his voice cracking in sheer panic. We don't have that much gold in our vaults. Our entire liquid treasury barely holds 15,000 gold. The kingdom is in a currency shortage. You have to give us 3 years to liquidate our assets. Luke's smile turned completely cold. If the borrower cannot produce the liquid coin, Section 18 of the contract states that the Black Lotus Consortium exercises immediate, unconditional right of foreclosure over all pledged collateral assets. Luke read from the deed. This includes the total ownership deeds of the 3 ancestral iron mines of House Vance, the eastern agricultural valleys, the southern vineyard estates, and the master capital manor in which you are currently standing. Eleanor's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the marble floor, gasping for air as if she were drowning in freezing water. No, you can't do this. This is our ancestral home. The king will never allow a foreign bank to seize a ducal estate. The king has already signed the foreclosure authorization, Duchess. A voice echoed from the grand double doors. The room went dead, suffocatingly silent. The double doors of the grand hall swung open. Ethan Vance walked into the room, wearing his immaculate midnight black grand marshal coat, his boots clicking with terrifying, rhythmic precision against the marble tiles. Behind him marched Commander Gareth and 20 elite soldiers of the Iron Ghost Legion. Duke Patrick looked at his eldest son, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope sparking in his cowardly eyes. He scrambled down the stairs on all fours, reaching for Ethan Vance's boots like a drowning man grabbing a piece of driftwood. Ethan Vance, my son, thank the gods you're here, Patrick wept, tears and snot running down his face. These foreign bankers are trying to destroy our family. They're trying to seize our ancestral mines and our home. You are the Grand Marshal. You have the king's ear. Use your military authority to execute these debt collectors and burn these contracts. Ethan Vance looked down at his father kneeling in the dirt. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't show a shred of anger. He simply looked at Patrick with the absolute, freezing contempt of a god looking at a worm squirming in the mud. Lieutenant Luke stepped forward, placing his right hand over his heart, and bowed 90 degrees toward Ethan Vance. Chairman Ethan Vance, all assets of House Vance have been successfully inventoried and secured under your personal authority. Duke Patrick froze. Eleanor froze. The entire Grand Hall felt as if the temperature had dropped by 50 degrees in a single heartbeat. See, Chairman, Ethan Vance. Patrick choked on his own breath, looking up at his son with wide, bloodshot eyes that couldn't process reality. Ethan Vance slowly walked past his father, climbing the marble staircase with regal, absolute majesty. He reached the elevated landing where the grand ducal throne of House Vance sat, the ancestral seat where Duke Patrick had once looked down on him and sentenced him to die on the frozen northern border. Ethan Vance turned and sat down upon the throne, resting his chin upon his hand, crossing his long legs in a posture of supreme, untouchable sovereignty. He looked down at Patrick and Eleanor shivering on the floor below. You wanted to know who owns the Black Lotus Bank, father? Ethan Vance's voice resonated across the grand hall like the toll of a funeral bell. I built it. While you were sitting comfortably by your fireplace, celebrating my presumed death in the snow, I conquered the northern trade routes. While Eleanor was spending hundreds of thousands of gold to dress her idiot son in fake metals, she was borrowing every single copper coin directly from my personal vault. Ethan Vance leaned forward, his eyes burning with the cold, ruthless fire of 100 conquerors who had crushed dynasties underfoot. House Vance does not belong to you anymore, Patrick. The mines belong to me. The lands belong to me. Even the very floor you are kneeling on belongs to me. Ethan Vance raised his hand, pointing toward the estate entrance. Eleanor, Julian Vance, you have exactly 60 minutes to pack 2 suitcases of basic clothing and get out of my sight. If you are still on this property when the sun touches the garden wall, my guards will strip you naked and throw you into the commoner's gutter where you belong. Eleanor let out a blood-curdling, broken shriek of pure, unadulterated despair, clawing at the marble tiles as the reality of her total, absolute destruction crushed her soul into dust. The trap was closed, the stepfamily was destroyed. And now, the final judgment for the cowardly Duke Patrick was about to be delivered. If you've ever watched a parasite get ripped off a healthy host, you know it never lets go with dignity. It thrashes, it screeches, and it tries to leave one last drop of poison in the wound before it gets crushed under a boot. Within 45 minutes of Ethan Vance's sovereign declaration inside the Grand Hall of House Vance, the eviction was in full, brutal swing. 24 heavily armored soldiers of the Iron Ghost Legion marched through the opulent corridors of the Master Manor, systematically tossing Alina's velvet dresses, her gilded mirrors, and Julian Vance's gaudy collection of gold-plated ceremonial swords out into the central courtyard. Every single chest of clothing was searched with enchanted detection stones. When Alina attempted to smuggle out 3 velvet pouches filled with royal diamond earrings and gold ingots hidden inside the lining of her fur cloak, Commander Gareth personally tore the cloak off her shoulders, tossing the jewels into the official Black Lotus repossession chest. "Thief, barbarian!" Alina shrieked, her voice echoing across the courtyard like a dying crow, her manicured fingers clawing at the dirt. "Those were gifts from my father. You have no right to touch my personal jewelry." Gareth didn't even blink. He looked down at her with cold, bored disgust. Everything on this property was purchased with loans drawn against the Vance iron mines, Duchess. Under foreclosure law, you leave with 2 linen tunics, 1 wool blanket, and the boots on your feet. If you touch another silver spoon, I will snap your wrist in half. 10 minutes later, the massive iron gates of the Vance Capital estate swung open for the last time. Standing outside in the cobblestone square were over 1,000 capital commoners, merchants, and low-level aristocrats who had gathered after hearing rumors of the Black Lotus foreclosure. When Duchess Alina and Julian Vance were physically escorted out of the estate gates, carrying 2 cheap burlap sacks containing their basic clothes, the crowd erupted into deafening jeers and mockery. "Look at the Golden Knight of House Vance," a butcher bellowed, throwing a rotten cabbage that splattered right across Julian Vance's chest. "Don't soil your trousers on the way to the slums, Master Julian Vance." "Pay back the merchant guilds, you thieving parasites," a baker shouted, tossing stale dough. Julian Vance pulled his burlap sack over his head, weeping hysterically, stumbling down the cobblestone avenue like a broken dog. Alina glared at the jeering crowd with eyes of burning, venomous hatred, clutching her son's arm as they were driven into the dark, rain-soaked alleys of the lower capital slums. For 18 years, Alina had believed she was an untouchable aristocratic goddess who ruled the capital with silk and perfume. Now she was sitting on a damp, flea-infested mattress inside a dilapidated basement tenement. The smell of open sewage wafting through the cracked window, listening to the rain drip into a rusted iron bucket. Julian Vance lay on the floor in the corner, rocking back and forth in a fetal position, his mind completely shattered by the trauma of his public downfall. "Mother," Julian Vance sobbed, his voice hollow and dead, "we're finished. Everyone is laughing at us. The king hates us. Ethan Vance has everything." "Shut up," Alina hissed, her eyes gleaming with the manic, rabid insanity of a cornered beast. She reached deep into the tangled mess of her matted hair, pulling out a small, hollow bone hairpin. She twisted the cap, revealing a single, uncut blood-core fire diamond, a priceless ancient relic she had stolen from Duchess Melissa's jewelry box 13 years ago, worth over 50,000 gold crowns. "We are not finished," Alina whispered, her lips curling into a horrifying, twisted grin. "Ethan Vance thinks he has won because he holds the deeds and the ledgers. But deeds and ledgers don't protect your throat from a poisoned dagger in the dark." That very night, beneath the flooded catacombs of the capital's underworld, in a secluded cavern lit by green alchemical torches, Alina met with the Grand Master of the Night Serpent Guild, the most lethal, ruthless underground assassin syndicate in the kingdom. The Guildmaster, a masked shadow stalker known only as Viper, turned the blood-core fire diamond in his gloved fingers, admiring its mesmerizing crimson glow. "A genuine ancient fire diamond," Viper rasped, his voice sounding like 2 rusty knives grinding together. "Worth 60,000 gold on the black market, and whose throat does the disgraced Duchess wish for us to open?" Alina stepped forward, the shadows of the torches twisting her pale, haggard face into a demonic mask. "Grand Marshal Ethan Vance. He sleeps in the central pavilion of the Vance estate. I want you to send your top shadow stalkers tonight. Cut his tendons, rip out his tongue, and bring me his severed head before the sun rises." Viper let out a cold, hissing chuckle. Grand Marshal Ethan Vance is a war hero with 50 elite guards surrounding his pavilion, but even war heroes bleed when 3 drops of Spectre's Bane poison touch their skin. Consider the contract sealed, Duchess. By dawn, your stepson will be a cold corpse. Eleanor smiled with pure, vindictive ecstasy, imagining Ethan Vance choking on his own blood while she reclaimed the estate. What Eleanor's pathetic, low IQ mind failed to realize was a simple, terrifying reality that every great scholar in Ethan Vance's soul understood. In a corrupt kingdom, the underworld does not exist in a vacuum. The underworld is simply a subsidiary of whoever controls the banks. 2:00 a.m., the central pavilion of House Vance. The estate was shrouded in heavy, pitch-black autumn mist. 6 shadowy figures, clad in enchanted shadow cloaks that absorbed all sound and light, slipped over the garden wall like liquid smoke. These were the 6 fangs of the Night Serpent, elite master assassins who had butchered high-ranking counts and royal magistrates without leaving a single trace of evidence. Moving with terrifying, supernatural silence, the 6 assassins scaled the marble pillars of the central pavilion, slipping through the second-floor balcony doors into the master bedchamber. The room was pitch black. On the massive 4-poster bed sat a silhouette lying beneath the heavy velvet blankets. The lead assassin glided forward, unsheathing a jagged obsidian dagger dripping with glowing green Spectre's Bane poison. With a lightning-fast, lethal thrust, he drove the blade straight through the center of the blanket. Thud! The blade didn't hit warm flesh. It struck solid, cold iron. Before the assassin could even pull his hand back, the heavy velvet blanket was violently yanked away, revealing a hollow armor dummy packed with 400 pounds of solid frost iron. "Searching for someone?" a calm, melodic voice asked from the shadows. Clack! 4 massive mana floodlights detonated around the bedchamber, instantly blinding the 6 assassins in a searing blast of brilliant white light. The assassins frantically scrambled to draw their smoke bombs, only to realize that 30 heavily armored soldiers of the Iron Ghost Legion, armed with repeating enchanted crossbows, were already lining the perimeter of the room. Their bolts aimed directly at their eye sockets. Sitting casually in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, sipping hot black tea with his legs crossed, was Grand Marshal Ethan Vance. Beside him stood Commander Gareth, who was holding the severed, bloody head of the assassin guildmaster, Viper, by his dark hair. The 6 assassins froze in absolute paralyzed terror. "How?" the lead assassin choked out. "How did you know we were coming?" Ethan Vance set his teacup down on the mahogany side table, looking at the trapped assassins with that signature, terrifying smile. "Did you truly believe the Night Serpent Guild operated in secrecy?" Ethan Vance murmured softly. "The Black Lotus Consortium purchased your guild's weapon supply lines 18 months ago. We own the safe house you met Eleanor in. We even manufactured the green poison currently dripping from your dagger." Ethan Vance waved his hand dismissively toward Gareth. "Disarm them. Break their kneecaps so they cannot swallow their suicide pills. Tomorrow morning, we are taking these 6 lovely guests to the Royal High Court of Justice." The next morning, the Grand Hall of Royal Justice was packed with over 400 high-ranking nobles, royal judges, and foreign dignitaries. Presiding over the High Tribunal was the Chief Justice of the realm, Lord Brandon, flanked by the kingdom's supreme legal ministers, and Princess Sylvia, who represented the royal crown. Duchess Eleanor was dragged into the prisoner's iron dock by 2 royal guards. Her dress was torn, her hair was a bird's nest, and she was screaming hysterically that she was being framed. "Silence in the court!" Chief Justice Brandon slammed his heavy ivory gavel, his voice echoing with absolute legal authority. The Chief Justice looked down at Eleanor with utter disgust before turning to Ethan Vance, who stood at the prosecutor's podium in his immaculate Grand Marshal uniform. "Grand Marshal Ethan Vance, you have filed emergency charges of high treason, conspiracy to commit fratricide, embezzlement of strategic state assets, and contract of illegal blood syndicates against Duchess Eleanor Vance. Present your evidence before the Crown." Ethan Vance stepped forward with the calm, devastating precision of an imperial prosecutor, who had memorized 5 centuries of constitutional law. With the court's permission, Ethan Vance's voice resonated across the marble hall. Ethan Vance pointed to the center of the courtroom floor. Item 1. The living testimony and signed confessions of the 6 master assassins of the Night Serpent Guild, who were captured inside the Vance estate last night on an active contract to assassinate a supreme grand marshal of the realm. The 6 bound assassins were marched in, dropping to their knees and loudly confirming that Duchess Alina had personally hired them to butcher Ethan Vance. Item 2, Ethan Vance continued, presenting an enchanted velvet box to the judges. The payment provided by Alina to the assassin guildmaster, the Bloodcore Fire Diamond. An ancestral heirloom bearing the personal magical seal of my deceased mother, Duchess Melissa, which Alina illegally stole from the estate vaults 13 years ago. Alina shrieked, clawing at the iron bars of the prisoner dock. Lies, forgeries, he fabricated everything. Item 3, Ethan Vance stated, completely ignoring her screeching. The signed confessions of former Minister Marquis Lawrence, detailing Alina's treasonous conspiracy to sell northern iron quotas to hostile foreign entities. Alongside 50 forged loan agreements embezzling over 600,000 gold crowns from state-guaranteed credit reserves. Princess Sylvia stood up from the royal tribunal, her sapphire eyes blazing with cold, righteous fury. The evidence is absolute, overwhelming, and incontrovertible, Princess Sylvia declared, her royal voice ringing with sovereign authority. Duchess Alina Vance has not only brought profound shame upon the nobility, but her actions constitute an active, violent threat to the security of the kingdom and the life of its greatest war hero. Chief Justice Brandon slammed his heavy ivory gavel with a thunderous crack. By the unanimous verdict of the Royal High Tribunal and the authority of the Crown of Valerius. The Chief Justice read the final sentence. Duchess Alina Vance is hereby found guilty of high treason, attempted murder of a Grand Marshal, and illegal blood contracts. She is permanently stripped of all noble titles. Her family name is struck from the aristocratic registry, and she is sentenced to lifelong hard labor in the Southern Salt Mines without possibility of pardon. Slam, N-O-O. Alina screamed, a sound of pure, shattered madness tearing from her throat as 2 burly prison guards clamped heavy iron monoshackles around her wrists. And regarding Julian Vance, the Chief Justice concluded with cold finality. For his complicity in fraudulent knight credentials, illegal combat drug usage, and embezzlement of family reserves. He is permanently stripped of all noble standing, banned from ever holding military or civil office, and exiled as a common laborer to the outer agricultural colonies. Alina was dragged screaming and thrashing across the marble floor, her fingernails clawing uselessly against the stone. Weeping tears of pure blood as the heavy iron doors of the royal dungeon slammed shut behind her forever. Sitting in the front row of the spectator gallery, watching his wife get dragged to the salt mines and his beloved second son reduced to a penniless slave, was Duke Patrick Vance. Patrick was shaking violently from head to toe, clutching his chest, his face completely drained of all color, realizing that every single person he had favored over Ethan Vance had just been wiped from the face of the earth. Ethan Vance slowly turned his head, his dark, merciless eyes locked onto Duke Patrick sitting alone on the wooden bench. Ethan Vance took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward his father, leaning down until his lips were inches from Patrick's ear. Alina and Julian Vance have received their punishment, father, Ethan Vance whispered, his voice like the freezing wind of the northern tundra. And tomorrow morning, you and I are going to settle the final score. There is a specific, pathetic brand of cowardice that only exists in men who have spent their entire lives hiding behind inherited titles and other people's achievements. When things are going well, they puff out their chests, take all the credit, and lecture everyone beneath them about duty and honor. But the second the walls cave in, they immediately drop to their knees, wipe their tears on your boots, and claim they were the real victim all along. The 24 hours following Alina's public sentencing to the southern salt mines had turned the Vance capital estate into an eerie, suffocating tomb. Every single servant in the manor was now wearing the black and silver insignia of the Black Lotus Consortium. The Master Guards had been replaced by iron-faced veterans of the Iron Ghost Legion, whose heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed through the polished marble corridors with the steady cadence of a funeral march. Up in the Master's study on the third floor, Duke Patrick Vance was sitting in the dark, surrounded by empty crystal bottles of high-proof Southern brandy. His eyes were bloodshot, his silver hair disheveled, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his glass. In less than a week, his entire world had been pulverized into dust. His wife was chained in a slave cart bound for the salt mines. His beloved second son, Julian Vance, was scrubbing pigsties in the outer colonies. His political allies had either been executed, arrested, or had fled the kingdom. And now, sitting in the vast, silent mansion he had ruled for 30 years, Patrick realized he was completely, terrifyingly alone. CREEK. The heavy oak doors of the master study swung open without a knock. Commander Gareth stepped into the room, his massive frost-iron pauldron scraping against the doorframe, his single visible eye looking down at the drunken Duke with cold, disgusted indifference. "Duke Patrick," Gareth rumbled, his deep voice vibrating the glassware on the table. "The Grand Marshal has summoned you to the Ancestral Council Chamber. Move your legs." Patrick scrambled to his feet, knocking over an empty brandy bottle that shattered across the Persian rug. He grabbed his ivory-toothed cane with trembling hands, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The Ancestral Council Chamber of House Vance was a colossal, vaulted hall of dark gray granite. Hanging from the 50-foot stone walls were the grand oil portraits of the past 7 generations of the Vance dukes, mighty warlords and iron-fisted conquerors who had forged the province through fire and steel. And sitting at the head of the massive 60-foot black marble council table, directly beneath the portrait of Duchess Melissa, sat Ethan Vance. The room was lit only by a roaring fire in the massive stone hearth. Ethan Vance wore a simple, tailored black tunic, his fingers laced calmly over the edge of the table. Standing behind him in complete, motionless silence were Lieutenant Luke and 4 inner captains of the Iron Ghost Legion. When Duke Patrick shuffled into the room, his knees were shaking so hard he had to lean heavily on his cane. Seeing Ethan Vance sitting there, looking so composed, so regal, so terrifyingly powerful, Patrick felt a desperate, pathetic spark of hope flare up in his cowardly chest. Patrick forced his face into a tearful, paternal mask of sorrow. He dropped his cane, stumbled forward, and fell to both knees at the foot of the table, clutching his chest with both hands. "Ethan Vance," Patrick wept, tears and snot streaming down his flushed cheeks. "My son, my glorious boy, thank the heavens we finally have a moment alone, away from the judges and the soldiers." Ethan Vance didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply watched his father's theatrical performance with the cold, scientific curiosity of a doctor examining a diseased rat. "You have no idea the agony I've endured these past 5 years, Ethan Vance," Patrick cried out, his voice cracking with manufactured grief. "Eleanor, that evil, scheming witch, she deceived me, Ethan Vance. She manipulated my grief after your sweet mother passed. She poisoned my mind with lies, whispering that you were weak, that you needed to be tested." Patrick reached out, attempting to grasp the edge of Ethan Vance's velvet sleeve. "When I sent you to the north, it wasn't out of cruelty, my boy, it was out of love. I knew you possessed the true, untamed fire of the Vance bloodline. I knew that a harsh environment would forge you into a diamond. And look at you now, Grand Marshal of the realm, savior of the kingdom. Everything I did was to push you toward your glorious destiny. We did it together, my son. You and I shall rule this duchy side by side." For 3 full seconds, the only sound in the colossal granite hall was the crackling of the fireplace. Lieutenant Luke looked away, struggling not to laugh at the sheer, unhinged audacity of the man. Commander Gareth let out a low, disgusted snort. "And Ethan Vance?" Ethan Vance slowly leaned back in his high-backed leather chair. And then he laughed. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a cold, terrifying, resonant sound, the collective mockery of 100 ancient dynastic conquerors who had watched hundreds of sniveling, desperate tyrants beg for their lives before the executioner's block. "A test of love," Ethan Vance murmured, his voice cutting through the hall like a razor blade sliding over ice. "A father forging his son into a diamond." Ethan Vance reached into his tunic pocket, pulling out a faded, yellowed parchment sealed with Duke Patrick's personal red wax stamp from 5 years ago. He tossed it onto the table right in front of Patrick's face. "Read it, father." Patrick looked down at the parchment, and the last drop of blood drained completely from his face. It was the original secret mobilization Order 409, dated the exact morning of Ethan Vance's 18th birthday, sent directly to the corrupt former commander of Outpost 9. Ethan Vance's voice dropped to a low, chilling whisper that rattled the very foundations of the room. "To Captain Vane, the bearer of this draft notice is Ethan Vance. You are hereby instructed under ducal authority to place him in the vanguard of the 7th Penal Company during the first barbarian skirmish. Ensure that no body is recovered, and report his death as an unavoidable operational casualty." Ethan Vance stood up from his chair. As he rose, the suffocating, bone-crushing aura of 100 conquerors flooded the council chamber like an ocean of liquid lead. The temperature in the room plummeted by 30 degrees. The flames in the grand fireplace flickered and turned an eerie, spectral blue. Duke Patrick couldn't breathe. The invisible kinetic pressure was so immense that his face was slammed flat against the cold black marble floor. His ribs groaning under the weight of sheer, unadulterated sovereign wrath. "You didn't test me, Patrick." Ethan Vance's voice boomed like the judgment of the heavens. "You signed a contract to have your own 18-year-old flesh and blood murdered in the frozen mud. Also, you could spend my mother's dowry on velvet dresses for a cheap count's daughter and gold medals for an incompetent bastard." Patrick lay pinned to the marble floor, gasping for air, weeping in pure, unadulterated terror as his bladder gave out for the second time, soaking his silk trousers. "Mercy," Patrick wheezed, his fingers clawing at the stone. "Ethan Vance, please, I am your father, blood of your blood, have mercy." Ethan Vance walked around the table, stopping 3 inches from Patrick's shivering head. "Mercy is a currency reserved for men of honor, Patrick. You are not a man. You are an empty, cowardly husk that wore a duke's mantle." Ethan Vance signaled with his hand. Lieutenant Luke stepped forward, placing a thick, gilded parchment document onto the floor beside Patrick's nose, along with a bottle of black ink and a silver quill. "This is the unconditional abdication of the ducal coronet of House Vance," Ethan Vance stated with absolute legal finality. "By signing this document, you permanently forfeit all titles, all lands, all ancestral authority, and all legal status as the head of House Vance, transferring total, irrevocable sovereignty of the Vance Duchy to me." Ethan Vance looked down at his father with eyes of absolute zero. "If you sign it, you leave this room breathing. If you refuse, I hand that secret assassination order to Chief Justice Brandon in 30 minutes. You will be stripped of your nobility before the king and hung by the neck from the great royal arch as a traitor to the crown." Patrick didn't even hesitate for half a second. With trembling, ink-stained fingers, weeping like a broken child, Patrick grabbed the silver quill and violently scribbled his signature across the bottom of the abdication decree, stamping it with his personal blood-wax seal. Luke picked up the signed decree, blowing on the wet ink with a cold, triumphant smile. "The document is valid and fully executed, my lord." Patrick slowly pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, looking up at Ethan Vance with pathetic, pleading eyes. "I signed it," Patrick sobbed. "I gave you everything, Ethan Vance, the title, the wealth, the army. Please, let me retire to our southern vineyard. Just a small cottage in the south, with a warm fireplace and a garden. I will never show my face in the capital again." Ethan Vance looked down at his father, his lips curving into a slow, merciless smile that promised pure, poetic damnation. "A warm southern vineyard," Ethan Vance scoffed softly. "Patrick, did you truly believe you would get to spend your golden years sipping wine by a warm fire after what you did?" Ethan Vance leaned down, his eyes boring straight into Patrick's soul. 5 years ago, you sent an 18-year-old boy to the frozen, blood-soaked mud of the Frostbite Gorge. You told the entire kingdom that the northern meat grinder was the perfect place to forge character and prove one's worth. Ethan Vance pointed toward the northern window, where a freezing autumn wind howled against the glass. "Therefore, father, Outpost 9 shall be your retirement estate." "What?" Patrick's eyes went wide with pure, mind-shattering horror. No, no, not the north. I'll freeze to death. I have arthritis. I can't survive the tundra. You will survive just fine, Ethan Vance replied calmly. Commander Gareth has already arranged your new position. You will serve as the chief latrine cleaner of the 7th Penal Vanguard. You will wake up at 4:00 a.m. every morning in the snow. You will eat stale black bread, and you will scrub the barracks floors until your hands are raw. Ethan Vance turned his back on his father. Strip him. Two massive Iron Ghost legionnaires stepped forward. In less than 20 seconds, they ripped the velvet mantle, the gold-embroidered tunic, and the diamond rings off Duke Patrick's body, leaving him shivering in the freezing room. They threw a coarse, scratchy, gray wool convict's tunic over his head, the exact same cheap, moth-eaten uniform Ethan Vance had been forced to wear 5 years ago. Itiachan Vigenci, please, I am your father, Itiachan Vigenci, and oh. Patrick's shrill, frantic screams echoed through the corridors as the two legionnaires dragged him down the marble stairs, his boots scraping helplessly against the stone. They threw him into the back of an unheated, open wooden prisoner cart waiting in the dark courtyard. With a crack of a whip, the cart rolled through the grand estate gates, carrying the disgraced, shivering former Duke north toward the exact frozen hellhole where he had tried to bury his legitimate son. 5:30 a.m., the grand balcony of House Vance. The first rays of the morning sun broke through the heavy autumn mist, casting a brilliant, golden light across the spires of the royal capital. Ethan Vance stood on the marble balcony, wearing his pristine midnight black uniform, his broad chest decorated with the grand cross of the sun, the cool morning breeze whipping his dark hair. Behind him, Lieutenant Luke and Commander Gareth stood at rigid attention. "Report on the duchy, Luke," Ethan Vance said, looking out over the awakening city. "My lord," Luke stepped forward, holding a golden ledger. "The Royal Council and the King have officially ratified your abdication decree. As of sunrise today, you are formally recognized as the 9th Duke of House Vance, Supreme Lord of the Northern Province, and Grand Protector of the Iron Valleys." Luke smiled with deep, genuine pride. "The traitors have been completely purged, my lord. Eleanor is in the salt mines. Julian Vance is in the labor colonies. Patrick is on his way to the frozen wall. The entire Vance Duchy, every mine, every city, every soldier, answers exclusively to your command." Ethan Vance slowly raised his hand, resting it against the marble balustrade. Inside his mind, the ethereal chamber of the 100 conquerors fell completely, reverently silent. The 100 ancient warlords and grand scholars who had guided him through 18 years of hidden patience and 5 years of brutal battlefield slaughter stood around the round table and bowed in unison to their living sovereign. The revenge was complete, the past was buried. The discarded prodigy had reclaimed his throne, dismantled his enemies with surgical perfection, and consolidated absolute, untouchable power across the entire kingdom. Ethan Vance's eyes burned with cold, ambitious gold as he looked toward the northern horizon. "This was only the foundation, Luke," Ethan Vance murmured softly, his voice carrying the terrifying promise of an empire about to be born. "Prepare the industrial furnaces in the north, double the production of frost iron armor, drill the Iron Ghost Legion day and night." Ethan Vance turned to his commanders, his voice echoing across the balcony like thunder. "Because a storm is gathering on the continent, and when the Empire's march, House Vance will not merely defend. We will conquer." Most conquerors throughout history make the exact same fatal mistake. They believe that once you kill your enemies and put the crown on your head, the work is finished. They sit on their golden thrones, drink expensive wine, and let the kingdom rot until the next ambitious monster kicks their palace doors down. But for Ethan Vance, vengeance was never the final goal. Vengeance was simply clearing out the rotted timber so the foundation of a true empire could be poured. The morning of Ethan Vance's formal coronation, as the 9th Duke of House Vance, was held inside the colossal, stained-glass sanctuary of the great royal cathedral of Valerius. Over 800 high lords, royal ministers, and foreign ambassadors were gathered in dead, reverent silence. Standing upon the elevated marble altar, King Valerius Roman III held the ancient ducal coronet of iron and gold. A master-forged crown of dark glacial steel inlaid with radiant sun diamonds. Beside the king stood Princess Sylvia, wearing a magnificent gown of sapphire silk. Her eyes shining with profound admiration as Ethan Vance knelt before the altar in his immaculate midnight black Grand Marshal uniform. King Valerius Roman III placed the heavy coronet upon Ethan Vance's dark hair, his royal voice echoing across the soaring stone arches. By the divine right of the crown and the unanimous will of the High Council, we hereby crown Ethan Vance as the 9th Duke of House Vance, Supreme Sovereign of the Northern Province and Grand Protector of the Iron Valleys. Rise, Lord Duke. Clang, clang, clang. The cathedral bells pealed in thunderous celebration. Over 800 nobles bowed in unison, their voices rising in a roaring chant. Long live the Iron Duke! Long live the Guardian Dragon! Princess Sylvia stepped forward, presenting Ethan Vance with a small, intricately carved silver case containing the royal sovereign crystal, a direct, encrypted magical communication artifact connected exclusively to her private chambers and the king's throne room. House Vance has never possessed a leader of such extraordinary vision, Lord Ethan Vance, Sylvia whispered, her cheeks flushing with a faint, radiant warmth. The royal crown stands firmly beside you. Ethan Vance took the silver case, bowing with the flawless grace of an imperial scholar. And as long as the crown honors justice, Your Highness, the Iron Legion shall be its unbreakable shield. 2 weeks later, Ethan Vance did not stay in the capital to indulge in endless victory balls and shallow aristocratic flatteries. Leaving Lieutenant Luke to manage the capital branch of the Black Lotus Consortium, Ethan Vance mounted his black warhorse and rode 400 miles north to the actual territorial heartland of House Vance, the Iron Valleys province. The Iron Valleys was a massive territory spanning 3,000 square miles of rugged mountains, deep pine forests, and vast agricultural plains, home to over 2 million citizens. However, when Ethan Vance rode through the provincial capital of Ironspire, the reality of what Duke Patrick and Alina had done to this land became brutally apparent. Decades of heavy, corrupt taxation had bled the province white. The local iron miners were working 14-hour shifts in unsafe, collapsing tunnels, paid in worthless company scrip while their families starved in shantytowns. The agricultural irrigation canals were clogged with silt, leaving 60% of the fertile valleys barren. The local provincial administrators, all appointed by Alina's corrupt relatives, were spending their days extorting commoner merchants and pocketing 60% of the regional tax revenue. The province was a slumbering, crippled giant. Standing atop the battlements of Ironspire Citadel, looking down over the impoverished city, Commander Gareth spat over the wall in disgust. Duke Patrick lived like an emperor in the capital while his own people ate dirt and boiled tree bark, Gareth growled. Shall I round up the corrupt local tax collectors and hang them from the city gate, my lord? Ethan Vance looked over the valley, his eyes glowing with the razor-sharp intellect of 100 grand chancellors and imperial state builders. Hanging them is too quick, Gareth, Ethan Vance said calmly. Seize all their personal assets, throw them into the iron mines to work the deepest shafts for the next 10 years. And summon every village elder, guildmaster, and mine foreman to the Citadel courtyard tomorrow morning. Ethan Vance turned toward his inner administrative council, his voice cold and resolute. It is time to show this kingdom what happens when a territory is governed not by greedy parasites, but by the mind of 100 empires. The next morning, Ethan Vance launched what history would later record as the great industrial and social renaissance of the North. Drawing upon the combined administrative wisdom, economic theories, and engineering genius of the 100 scholars inside his soul, Ethan Vance executed a simultaneous, three-pronged territorial revolution. 1. The economic and agrarian overhaul. Ethan Vance immediately abolished the 72 different arbitrary feudal taxes Alina had imposed on commoner trade. He injected 800,000 gold crowns directly from the Black Lotus treasury into regional public works. He deployed 5,000 soldiers of the Iron Ghost Legion, alongside local laborers to dig a 400-mile network of stone-reinforced irrigation canals connecting the glacial mountain rivers to the southern valleys. Within 6 months, crop yields across the Iron Valleys quadrupled, transforming the province from a food-scarce territory into the undisputed breadbasket of the entire kingdom. 2. The Great Industrial Blast Furnaces. Ethan Vance personally drafted the engineering blueprints for the continent's first mana-assisted blast furnaces. By combining northern glacial frost iron with concentrated mana ice crystals extracted from his secret northern mines, Ethan Vance's new foundries produced steel that was 4 times lighter, 5 times harder, and naturally resistant to elemental magic. Weapon and armor production skyrocketed by 800%. Where other noble houses took 3 months to equip a single knightly company, Ethan Vance's foundries were pumping out standardized, high-grade frost iron armor sets for 5,000 heavy legionnaires every 48 hours. 3. The meritocratic social reformation. In a feudal world where birth and noble blood determined everything, Ethan Vance shattered the system completely. He issued the ducal merit decree. Any commoner, miner, or peasant who showed extraordinary talent in craftsmanship, agriculture, administrative governance, or combat was granted immediate tax exemptions, free education in newly constructed provincial academies, and the right to hold civil office. He raised miner wages by 300%, established state-funded medical clinics in every mining town, and guaranteed a full pension for the families of every soldier who served in the Iron Ghost Legion. 1 year later, the Iron Valleys province had undergone a transformation so radical, so breathtaking, that foreign travelers and capital merchants who visited the territory believed they had crossed into an entirely different civilization. The once impoverished city of Ironspire had expanded into a colossal, fortified metropolis of polished stone and gleaming glass. Stone-paved highways crisscrossed the province, protected by regular Iron Ghost cavalry patrols that eradicated banditry to absolute zero. Massive watermills powered state-of-the-art textile mills and automated iron forges. The markets were overflowing with golden wheat, fresh mountain beef, imported elven silks, and the finest manufactured goods on the continent. Over 300,000 refugees, skilled blacksmiths, master alchemists, and ambitious scholars from across the kingdom, fleeing the corrupt taxes and stagnation of the other duchies, flooded into the Vance province every month. The common folk no longer viewed House Vance as distant, oppressive tyrants. In every village tavern, town square, and mining community, portraits of Ethan Vance hung beside the hearth. The people didn't just respect Ethan Vance. They worshipped him with the fanatical, unshakable devotion of citizens who knew that their duke had lifted them out of the mud and given them dignity, wealth, and safety. By age 24, Ethan Vance had transformed the Vance Duchy into an independent, self-sustaining military and economic powerhouse. That surpassed the total economic output of all other 3 duchies in the kingdom combined. His standing army, the Iron Ghost Legion, had expanded from 10,000 northern veterans into a monolithic 50,000-strong professional fighting force. Every single legionnaire was equipped with standardized frost iron plate armor, enchanted repeating heavy crossbows, and tactical doctrine training that operated with the hive-mind synchronization of an ancient imperial war machine. Ethan Vance had built an impregnable utopian fortress. And it was precisely at this moment that the sky above the continent began to darken. Midnight, the highest observatory tower of Ironspire Citadel. Ethan Vance stood before a colossal, magical holographic projection of the continental map, watching glowing blue monolines trace trade routes and mountain passes. Beside him, Lieutenant Luke stepped into the observatory, holding a blood-stained, black-wax-sealed dispatch that had just arrived via a high-speed shadow falcon from the far southern border. Luke's face was dead serious, his breathing heavy with profound tension. "My lord," Luke began, his voice tight, "our deep-cover intelligence network in the Southern Empires has just confirmed the worst." Ethan Vance didn't look away from the map. "The Solarian Empire." "Yes, my lord," Luke swallowed hard. "The Solarian Continental Empire, under the command of Emperor Aurelius the Sun Conqueror, has just completed the total blitzkrieg annexation of the Kingdom of Valyria and the Holy Principality of Arden in less than 90 days. Luke pointed to the southern border of the holographic map. Emperor Aurelius has mobilized an unprecedented invasion armada of 500,000 Imperial legionnaires. Supported by 80 sun-forged siege titans and 12 10th Circle solar champions. Luke looked at Ethan Vance, terror flickering in the Shadow Master's eyes. Their vanguard has crossed the Dragon's Spine Mountains. They are marching directly toward the kingdom of Valerius. Their stated objective is the total, unconditional annihilation of our sovereignty and the enslavement of all 5 provinces. Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the ethereal council chamber of the 100 conquerors lit up with a blinding, golden blaze. The 100 ancient warlords, emperors, and grand tacticians who had slept peacefully for the past year suddenly rose from their seats, their battle-hardened souls roaring with the untamed, primordial thrill of total continental war. 500,000, an ancient conqueror laughed with pure, blood-soaked ecstasy. Finally, a real war, a battlefield worthy of an empire. The corrupt fools in the royal capital have been slumbering in their silk beds, a grand strategist added. Their southern garrisons will collapse like dry leaves in an autumn gale. Ethan Vance slowly stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his twin frost blades. He looked down at the peaceful, glittering lights of Ironspire City below, the paradise he had built with his own blood, sweat, and intellect. His eyes burned with the cold, absolute, untouchable fire of a sovereign, who would burn the entire continent to ash before allowing a single enemy soldier to set foot on his land. Luke, Ethan Vance said softly, his voice echoing across the tower like a gathering hurricane. My lords, mobilize all 50,000 legionnaires of the Iron Ghost Legion. Seal all mountain passes into the Iron Valleys. Put every blast furnace in the province on 24-hour maximum production. Ethan Vance turned toward the southern horizon, his lips curving into that dark, terrifying smirk that promised the doom of empires. The king and the pampered dukes in the capital are about to learn what a real war looks like. Let the Solarian Empire come. Ethan Vance's voice dropped to a chilling whisper, because when the southern gates fall, this entire continent is going to bow before the Ashen War God. There is a profound tragedy that repeats itself in every dying dynasty throughout history. When an empire is about to be consumed by fire, the people who scream the loudest warnings are called madmen, while the fools who promise that everything is fine are showered in gold. While the distant thunder of 500,000 Solarian Imperial legionnaires was vibrating the southern tectonic plates of the continent. The royal capital of Valerius was busy doing what it did best, drinking vintage wine, hosting vanity banquets, and bickering over tax boundaries. 3 days before the catastrophic invasion began, a discreet, unmarked royal carriage bearing no family crests rolled through the southern mountain pass into the Iron Valleys province. Sitting inside the carriage, looking out of the velvet-curtained window, was Princess Sylvia. Sylvia had made the 400-mile journey north in secret, disguised in a simple traveling cloak of dark wool, accompanied only by her 4 most trusted female royal bodyguards. She had heard the wild, almost mythological rumors circulating through the capital salons. That Ethan Vance had turned his ruined ancestral territory into an untouchable utopian fortress in less than 12 months. She wanted to see the truth with her own eyes. And the moment her carriage crossed the provincial stone archway, Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. Where she expected to see dirt paths rutted by wagon wheels and starving peasants begging by the roadside, she saw 80-foot wide, perfectly leveled stone highways paved with volcanic slate. Massive, steam-assisted transport carriages loaded with high-grade iron ingots and sacks of golden mountain grain moved with clockwork efficiency. Along the roadside, every 5 miles, stood stone guard posts manned by pairs of Iron Ghost Legionnaire veterans, checking trade manifests with polite, razor-sharp professionalism. Your Highness, her lead bodyguard whispered in absolute bewilderment, looking out the window. Are we truly in the northern province? This infrastructure, it surpasses the royal capital itself. When the carriage ascended the final mountain ridge, and the grand panoramic vista of Ironspire City opened before them, Sylvia gasped aloud. The city was a masterpiece of military-industrial geometry. Colossal, 50-foot stone walls fortified with automated monoballista towers surrounded the perimeter. In the industrial sector, 20 colossal mana-assisted blast furnaces were roaring day and night, casting an ethereal, vibrant azure glow into the twilight sky. The markets below were clean, vibrant, and packed with hundreds of thousands of smiling, well-dressed citizens, who carried themselves with the unmistakable pride of people who were well-fed, well-paid, and utterly unafraid of tomorrow. Sylvia had spent her entire life studying the ancient texts of empire building. And looking down at Ironspire, she realized that Ethan Vance was not just a brilliant general. He was a sovereign who had mastered the art of civilization. That evening, the high war room of Ironspire Citadel, Ethan Vance stood before the massive holographic tactical projection of the continent, reviewing supply logistics with Lieutenant Luke and Commander Gareth. When the heavy iron doors opened and Princess Sylvia stepped into the chamber, pulling back her velvet hood, to reveal her silver hair and striking sapphire eyes, the room went quiet. Gareth and Luke placed their hands over their chests, offering a crisp military salute, before bowing respectfully and exiting the room to grant them privacy. Ethan Vance stepped down from the command dais, bowing with the effortless, ancient grace that always made Sylvia's heart skip a beat. "Your Highness," Ethan Vance smiled warmly, "to what do I owe the extraordinary honor of a secret royal visit to our humble northern mountains?" Sylvia walked toward the holographic map, shaking her head with a soft, breathtaking laugh. "Humble Lord Ethan Vance, I have traveled across 3 kingdoms in my lifetime, and I have never seen a territory governed with such breathtaking perfection. Your factories, your roads, your people. You have accomplished in 1 year what the crown has failed to achieve in 3 centuries. A territory is only as strong as the dignity of its common folk, Your Highness," Ethan Vance replied smoothly. "A well-fed blacksmith who takes pride in his work will forge a blade that cuts through divine armor. A starving slave will drop his hammer the moment the enemy breaches the gate." Sylvia looked up into Ethan Vance's dark, commanding eyes, her expression turning somber and deeply troubled. "I wish the High Council in the capital shared even a fraction of your wisdom, Ethan Vance." Sylvia reached into her cloak, pulling out a sealed royal dispatch bearing the wax seal of the Grand Council of Lords. "Your formal military intelligence report warning of the Solarian Empire's 500,000-man mobilization was presented to the High Council yesterday morning," Sylvia said, her voice laced with bitter exhaustion. Ethan Vance raised an eyebrow. "And how did my esteemed noble peers react?" "They laughed," Sylvia whispered, clenching her delicate fists in anger. "Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder called your report alarmist fabrication. They claimed you were fabricating foreign threats to justify your massive troop buildup and extort additional defense subsidies from the royal treasury. Even my father, he is paralyzed by the council's complacency. He believes the southern dragon's spine mountains are an impassable natural barrier and refused to issue a national mobilization order." Ethan Vance didn't look surprised. In fact, a faint, cold smirk played on his lips. The look of a man who had watched dozens of decadent, rotting dynasties walk blindly off the edge of a cliff throughout 100 past lifetimes. "The greatest weapon of a conquering empire is never its swords, Princess," Ethan Vance said quietly. "It is the arrogant stupidity of the kingdom it plans to devour." Ethan Vance tapped the southern sector of the holographic map. A red monoline illuminated the Dragon's Spine mountain pass and the ancient Sungate fortress, the sole southern choke point protecting the kingdom of Valerius from the Solarian Empire. "The southern dukes believe the Sungate fortress is impregnable because its walls were built 400 years ago," Ethan Vance explained, his voice cold and analytical. "They have garrisoned it with barely 20,000 poorly trained conscripts, commanded by a corrupt noble nephew who spends his afternoons hunting foxes." Ethan Vance looked at Sylvia with terrifying, prophetic certainty. "The Solarian Empire is not going to lay siege to the Sungate Fortress, Princess. They possess sun-forged siege titans, colossal magical siege engines that fire concentrated solar beams capable of melting 5 feet of solid granite in 90 seconds. Ethan Vance's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "When the Solarian Empire attacks, the southern wall will not hold for 3 days. It will collapse in 3 hours." Sylvia felt a cold, paralyzing dread grip her spine. She looked at Ethan Vance, her voice trembling slightly. If the southern wall falls, the royal capital is completely exposed. The central plains have zero natural defenses. Ethan Vance, what will you do? Ethan Vance slowly placed his hand gently over Sylvia's shoulder, his touch steady, warm, and commanding. House Vance has 50,000 fully equipped, unbreakable Iron Ghost Legionnaire soldiers ready to march at a moment's notice, Princess. But I will not waste a single drop of my men's blood to save corrupt dukes who scoffed at my warnings. Ethan Vance's eyes burned with cold, regal gold. When the capital burns, and when your father's council is on its knees begging for salvation, I will march. Not to save their rotting system, but to protect you, the innocent people of this realm, and to forge a new order from the ashes. Sylvia looked into Ethan Vance's eyes, seeing the undeniable, sovereign destiny written in his gaze. She didn't pull away. She slowly nodded, a silent, unbreakable pact of blood and steel sealed between them in the candlelight. 3 days later, midnight. The southern border of the kingdom of Valerius. The Sungate Fortress sat nestled between two towering, snow-capped granite peaks of the Dragon's Spine Mountains. Its colossal, 80-foot-tall white stone ramparts had guarded the kingdom for 4 centuries, earning the reputation of being an unbreachable shield. Up on the battlements, the garrison sentries were huddled around small charcoal braziers, complaining about the cold, their rusty spears leaning lazily against the stone wall. Suddenly, the southern horizon lit up. It was not the rising sun. It was 2:00 a.m. A blinding, searing radiance of pure, incandescent crimson and gold illuminated the midnight sky, turning the dark mountain peaks into silhouette teeth against an ocean of fire. Thud, thud, thud. The very tectonic plates of the mountain range began to violently tremble with a 7-magnitude earthquake. The sentries scrambled to the parapets, looking down into the southern valley, and what they saw instantly caused their bladders to give out in sheer, paralyzed horror. Emerging from the mountain fog was an endless, apocalyptic sea of 500,000 Solarian Imperial Legionnaire soldiers. Their golden plate armor and crimson capes stretching beyond the curvature of the earth. And towering above the infantry like mechanical gods of destruction were 20 sun-forged siege titans. 200-foot tall, 4-legged walking fortresses of enchanted brass and molten solar cores. Standing atop the command platform of the lead siege titan was Grand Inquisitor Hector, the supreme vanguard commander of the Solarian Empire. Hector wore golden sunplate armor, his eyes glowing with the terrifying 10th circle solar aura that had incinerated 3 kingdoms. Hector looked up at the ancient stone ramparts of the Sungate Fortress with the cold, bored contempt of a man looking at an anthill in his path. 400 years of history, Hector murmured, raising his golden scepter to the sky. Let us see if their stone can withstand the breath of the sun god. Hector swung his scepter down. All siege titans, maximum solar discharge, annihilate the gate. 20 colossal siege titans opened their massive, circular chest apertures in unison. 20 beams of blinding, 6,000-degree concentrated solar energy detonated across the night sky, striking the center of the Sungate Fortress simultaneously. The 80-foot-tall granite walls didn't just crack, they instantly vaporized. Thousands of tons of ancient stone were liquefied into rivers of boiling, bubbling white-hot lava in less than 40 seconds. The fortress garrison, 20,000 men, was disintegrated into ash before a single alarm horn could even be blown. A 500-foot-wide smoking breach of molten slag was blown directly through the mountain pass. Grand Inquisitor Hector drew his flaming broadsword, pointing it toward the northern horizon where the fertile plains of Valerius lay completely defenseless. The gate is open, Hector's voice boomed across 500,000 soldiers like thunder. March, legions of the sun, burn their cities, slaughter their lords, and drag their king in chains before the emperor. Hail the sun, hail conquest, 500,000 soldiers roared in unison, surging through the melted breach like an unstoppable, apocalyptic tidal wave of fire and iron. 6 hours later, sunrise. Inside the royal palace of the capital, the great disaster bell, a massive bronze bell only rung when the kingdom itself was on the verge of total destruction, began to toll with a deafening, frantic cadence. Dong 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 dong. The throne room was in utter, screaming pandemonium. Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder were pale as corpses, clutching their chests, screaming in hysterical terror as dispatch after dispatch arrived from the south. The Sungate Fortress has fallen, 20,000 men vaporized in the opening strike. The southern duchies are in flames. Duke Ravenwood's private army was wiped out in 45 minutes. Over 400,000 Solarian legionnaires are advancing across the central plains. They will reach the capital gates in 72 hours. King Valerius Roman III sat upon his golden throne, his face completely drained of life, his crown slipping sideways on his head, staring into the abyss of his kingdom's total extinction. The king slowly looked up, his voice cracking with immense, suffocating despair. Ethan Vance was right, the king whispered, tears of sheer regret spilling from his eyes. We didn't listen, and now we are all going to burn. Princess Sylvia stepped forward into the center of the panicked throne room, her sapphire eyes burning with absolute, desperate clarity. Father, Sylvia's voice cut through the screaming lords like a lightning bolt. There is only one man on this entire continent who can stop 500,000 imperial soldiers. There is only one man who possesses an army forged in hell. Sylvia held up the glowing royal sovereign crystal. Summon the Iron Duke, summon the Ashen War God, summon Ethanvigency before we all die. There is a brutal, mathematical certainty to modern warfare. An army built on paper titles, aristocratic nepotism, and stolen wealth will collapse in 60 seconds, the moment it collides with a war machine forged in blood and discipline. In the 72 hours following the catastrophic vaporization of the Sungate Fortress, the southern and central provinces of the Kingdom of Valerius ceased to exist as organized territories. They became an open-air slaughterhouse. Grand Inquisitor Hector and the 500,000 imperial soldiers of the Solarian Continental Empire did not advance with the slow, measured caution of conventional armies. They moved with the apocalyptic speed of a tidal wave of fire. At the Battle of the Serena River, Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder, the very same arrogant nobles who had laughed at Ethan Vance's warnings in the throne room 3 days prior, attempted to assemble their private ducal armies to block the imperial crossing. They deployed 40,000 brightly dressed, private house guards armed with gilded spears and decorative silver shields. The battle lasted exactly 27 minutes. 4 colossal sun-forged siege titans marched straight into the middle of the river, their chest apertures opening to unleash a continuous 4,000-degree solar barrage that literally boiled the river into explosive clouds of scalding steam. The ducal cavalry were incinerated where they stood. The 40,000 house guards broke in blind, screaming terror, trampling their own commanders into the mud. Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder abandoned their men, leaping into high-speed enchanted carriages and fleeing toward the royal capital with tears streaming down their faces, leaving 50 miles of fertile central plains completely defenseless. Behind them, the Solarian legions swept across the kingdom like a plague of locusts. Fortresses were melted into slag, grain silos were seized. By the morning of the 4th day, the golden eagles of the Solarian Empire were planted at the foot of the outer walls of the royal capital. The royal capital of Valerius, a city of 1 million citizens, that had not witnessed enemy soldiers beneath its white marble walls in over 3 centuries, was completely surrounded. From the highest ramparts of the royal palace, looking out across the surrounding plains, the view was something pulled straight out of a nightmare. As far as the horizon stretched, the earth was blanketed in a sea of 350,000 Solarian Imperial Legionnaire soldiers, their golden plate armor reflecting the sun in a blinding, terrifying glare. Surrounding the city gates were 20 sun-forged siege titans, their 4 massive mechanical legs anchored into the dirt, their circular solar chest cores humming with a low-frequency, seismic vibration that rattled the stained glass windows of every cathedral in the capital. The city gates were barred with 5-foot-thick enchanted steel beams. But everyone from the lowest street beggar to the highest duke knew that against 20 solar siege engines, those gates wouldn't hold for 20 minutes. THOOM. A single, warning solar blast from the lead siege titan struck the outer watchtower of the Great Southern Gate, instantly disintegrating 300 tons of granite into a cloud of glowing white ash. A high-speed magical messenger arrow streaked over the city wall, embedding itself into the courtyard floor before the royal guard. Attached to the arrow was the unconditional ultimatum of Grand Inquisitor Hector. To King Valerius Roman III, you have 24 hours to open the capital gates. You will strip yourself of your crown, surrender all royal treasury vaults, and hand over Princess Sylvia to serve as a war concubine for the Imperial High Command. If these terms are not met by the setting of tomorrow's sun, the siege titans will open fire. The capital shall be burned to the bedrock, and every man, woman, and child inside your walls shall be put to the sword. Inside the grand throne room of the royal palace, the air was thick with the stench of pure, paralyzing panic. Over 200 high lords and ministers were gathered, screaming at each other, weeping openly, or clutching holy amulets in frantic, useless prayers. Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder, having barely escaped the Southern River massacre with their lives, were on their knees before King Valerius Roman III, their velvet robes torn and caked in mud. "Sire," Duke Ravenwood wept hysterically, grabbing the edge of the king's royal mantle. "We must accept the terms. We have barely 15,000 royal guards left in the city. If the Titans fire, we will all be burned alive. Hand over the treasury. Hand over Princess Sylvia. The Emperor is merciful. He will allow us to retain our lives as regional governors under imperial tribute." "Yes, sire," Duke Calder shrieked in agreement. "Princess Sylvia's sacrifice can save 1 million lives. We must surrender the gates before sunset." SHRRRRNG. The cold, lethal ring of unsheathed steel silenced the entire throne room in a fraction of a second. Princess Sylvia stood before the ducal kneeling benches, her royal rapier drawn. A razor-sharp tip pressed directly against the center of Duke Ravenwood's throat. Her sapphire eyes burned with the furious, unyielding fire of a true monarch. "If you speak one more word of treason, Duke Ravenwood," Sylvia's voice cut through the hall like a frozen diamond, "I will take your cowardly head off your shoulders right here before this throne." Ravenwood choked on his own breath, feeling the cold steel biting into his flesh, not daring to move a muscle. Sylvia turned toward the assembly of terrified nobles, her voice echoing across the marble vault with searing contempt. "For 20 years, you parasites have fattened your pockets on the kingdom's taxes. You laughed at Ethan Vance's warnings. You refused to mobilize the army. And the very second a real enemy appears at our gates, your first instinct is to crawl on your bellies and offer me as a slave to save your miserable, pathetic hides." King Valerius Roman III sat upon his golden throne, his weathered face buried in his trembling hands, weeping in profound, soul-crushing despair. "It is over, Sylvia," the king choked out, his voice broken and hollow. "The southern armies are wiped out. The western garrisons are cut off. There are 350,000 imperial soldiers outside our walls. We have no allies left. There is no one in this world who can save us." "There is one man, father," Sylvia shouted, stepping onto the throne dais. She reached into her royal robes and pulled out the gleaming, silver-encased royal sovereign crystal. "A man whose warnings you ignored. A man who built an army that doesn't run from giants. A man who owes this corrupt court nothing, but whose blade can shatter empires." Sylvia channeled her royal mana directly into the core of the crystal. A massive, 8-foot-tall holographic mana projection erupted in the center of the throne room, casting a brilliant, azure radiance across the terrified assembly. The holographic projection stabilized. The entire royal court gasped in stunned, breathless awe. Appearing in the projection was not a dark room or a chaotic war council. It was the colossal, paved parade grounds of Ironspire Citadel, 400 miles to the north. Standing in rigid, terrifying, 4-column formation across the vast stone plains were 50,000 legionnaires of the Iron Ghost Legion. Every single soldier was encased from head to toe in standardized, midnight blue frost iron plate armor, that radiated a lethal azure mana glow. They carried 8-foot frost lances, heavy tower shields, and repeating enchanted ballistas. Behind the infantry stood 10,000 heavy shock cavalry, mounted on armored northern battle rhinos. Their standard flags bearing the roaring white wolf fluttering in the mountain wind. Not a single soldier moved, not a single horse whinnied. The sheer, suffocating aura of 50,000 elite killers forged in the northern meat grinder radiated through the magical transmission with the crushing weight of an approaching cataclysm. And standing atop the 50-foot stone command rampart, overlooking his army, was Duke Ethan Vance. Ethan Vance wore his midnight black sovereign armor, his grand cross of the sun pinned over his heart, his twin frost blades resting at his hips. His eyes looked directly through the holographic projection into the throne room, cold, calm, and utterly detached from their panic. Grand Marshal Ethan Vance, King Valerius Roman III gasped, his voice trembling as he looked upon the invincible army in the projection. Ethan Vance looked at the king, his lips curling into that signature, terrifyingly calm smile. "Your Majesty, I see the southern weather has become somewhat warm. How are my esteemed ducal peers enjoying the alarmist fabrications they dismissed 3 days ago?" Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder cowered on the floor, unable to even meet Ethan Vance's holographic gaze. King Valerius Roman III slowly stood up from his golden throne. The 70-year-old monarch descended the marble steps, tears streaming down his face. And right there, before 200 high nobles and foreign ambassadors, the King of Valerius dropped to both knees before the holographic projection of Ethan Vance. "Ethan Vance," the king wept, his voice echoing across the silent hall, "I was a fool, the crown was blind. We treated you with neglect, we allowed your corrupt father to abuse you, and we ignored your wisdom when you tried to save us." The king bowed his head until his golden crown touched the marble floor. "I beg you, not for my crown, but for the 1 million innocent souls trapped inside these walls. Name your terms, Ethan Vance. Whatever you desire, gold, land, total sovereignty, the crown gives it all to you unconditionally." The king raised his trembling hands to the projection. "Save OUR kingdom, Iron Duke. March your legion and deliver US from the sun." Ethan Vance looked down at the kneeling king. Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the ethereal chamber of the 100 conquerors erupted into a deafening, thunderous roar of ultimate triumph. The moment had arrived. The corrupt old order had broken its own knees. Ethan Vance slowly raised his hand, pointing his finger directly through the projection toward the Capitol gates. "Rise, Your Majesty." Ethan Vance's voice boomed like the judgment of heaven itself across the throne room. "Tell your citizens to lock their doors and cover their ears, because the Iron Ghost Legion is marching." Ethan Vance's eyes blazed with the golden fire of total, apocalyptic warfare. "And by tomorrow's dawn, I will turn the Solarian Empire's glorious sun into an ocean of blood and ice. There is an absolute law in statecraft that has never failed in 10,000 years of recorded history. When a weak king falls to his knees and begs a real conqueror for salvation, power does not merely shift. It is permanently, irrevocably transferred." Inside the grand throne room of the besieged royal palace, King Valerius Roman III was still kneeling upon the cold marble floor. Before the towering holographic projection of Ethan Vance, the 200 high nobles, royal ministers, and foreign ambassadors held their breath. The silence in the hall so profound that the trembling gasps of the weeping king could be heard echoing off the gilded ceiling. Ethan Vance looked down through the magical transmission, his expression as unyielding and cold as the glacial granite of the northern peaks. "Your Majesty," Ethan Vance's voice resonated with the undeniable weight of an absolute sovereign. "If the Iron Ghost Legion marches, we do not march as paid mercenaries to prop up a corrupt regime that tried to sell Princess Sylvia into slavery 30 minutes ago." Ethan Vance signaled with his hand. Lieutenant Luke stepped forward into the projection, unfurling an ancient, golden-bordered scroll, bearing the grand seal of the Black Lotus and House Vance. "These are the non-negotiable terms of the blood covenant of absolute sovereignty," Ethan Vance stated with razor-sharp imperial authority. "Item 1. Supreme, unconditional, and irrevocable command over all military, economic, logistical, and territorial assets of the Kingdom of Valerius is transferred permanently to the Grand Marshal of House Vance. Item 2. The Grand Council of Lords is hereby dissolved with immediate effect. Duke Ravenwood and Duke Calder are stripped of all ducal titles. Their private estates are confiscated by the state, and they are placed under immediate military arrest for treason and cowardice in the face of the enemy. Item 3. The Vance Duchy is formally elevated to the status of an independent grand sovereign principality, recognizing House Vance as an equal sovereign power to the crown, with Princess Sylvia appointed as Supreme Royal Regent of the capital. Duke Ravenwood shrieked from the floor, his face purple with indignant terror. Treason, this is an open military coup. He is stripping US of our ancestral RIGHTS. Silence, King Valerius Roman III roared, his voice cracking with desperate, furious royal fury. The king didn't even hesitate for half a second. He bit into the tip of his right index finger, drawing fresh royal blood, and slammed his bloody thumbprint directly onto the parchment presented before the transmission dais, sealing it with the royal signet ring. Signed, sealed, ratified before the gods and the realm, King Valerius Roman III cried out, his eyes blazing with the desperate clarity of a man who knew this was his kingdom's only lifeline. The kingdom is yours, Sovereign Ethan Vance. March and save our people. Ethan Vance looked down at the signed covenant, his lips curving into a slow, terrifying smile. Understood, Your Majesty. Lock your gates, put out your torches. Ethan Vance's eyes flared with blinding azure mana. Because the storm of the north has just been unleashed. What occurred over the next 36 hours defied every known law of military logistics on the continent. Conventional military wisdom dictated that marching an army of 50,000 heavy infantry and cavalry 400 miles across rugged terrain required at least 3 weeks of agonizingly slow progress. Ethan Vance, however, possessed the combined intellect of 100 conquerors who had mastered the art of lightning blitzkrieg. Using the 800-mile network of stone-paved highways Ethan Vance had built over the past year, combined with hundreds of mana-assisted steam rail platforms and enchanted draft beasts from the northern breeding grounds, the Iron Ghost Legion didn't just march, they moved with the terrifying speed of an avalanche. Behind the 50,000 elite legionnaires rolled the secret arsenal Ethan Vance had spent 2 years forging inside the molten heart of Ironspire's blast furnaces. First, the glacial harpoons of the void. 50 colossal, mobile ballista platforms, each loaded with 15-foot-long harpoons forged from hypercompressed glacial frost iron, and packed with subterranean zero-degree mana cryocores, designed with one singular purpose, to puncture the armor of the Solarian siege titans and instantly freeze their molten solar cores to absolute zero. Second, the subterranean frost mine arrays. Lightweight sapper units deployed high-speed enchanted burrowing devices that planted thousands of concentrated cryo-detonators beneath the plains surrounding the capital, transforming the battlefield into an invisible, frozen minefield. Third, the 100 Doctrine phalanx. Every single legionnaire had been drilled until their reflexes operated with hive-mind synchronization. They were not separate men. They were 50,000 interlocking gears of a monolithic, merciless killing machine. By the evening of the second day, while the Solarian High Command was lazily counting down the final hours of their ultimatum outside the capital gates, the Iron Ghost Legion had already crossed the northern hills and formed up in battle ranks beneath the shroud of the evening mist. The next morning, 6:00 a.m., outside the grand white marble walls of the royal capital of Valerius, the 24-hour surrender ultimatum had officially expired. The morning sky was clear, the rising sun casting a bright golden light over the endless sea of 350,000 Solarian Imperial soldiers encamped across the plains. Grand Inquisitor Hector stood atop the command platform of his colossal lead, sun-forged siege titan, wearing his shimmering golden armor, holding his flaming broadsword. Beside him, his 12 solar commanders were laughing, watching the terrified royal guards peering over the city ramparts like cornered mice. They did not open the gates, Hector's deep, booming voice echoed through the amplification crystals of his armor. A pity, King Valerius Roman III chose ashes over servitude. Hector raised his flaming broadsword to the sky, his eyes blazing with 10th circle solar aura. All 20 sun-forged siege titans, activate maximum solar overdrive. Across the 3-mile siege line, the 20 colossal, 200-foot-tall mechanical titans began to violently shudder. The massive circular apertures in their brass chests peeled back like blooming lotus flowers, revealing blinding, roaring cores of concentrated, 6,000-degree white-hot solar plasma. The air in front of the Capitol gates began to shimmer and warp with blistering heat. The grass on the plains instantly caught fire, and the stone mortar between the Capitol's rampart blocks began to crack and bubble. Up on the walls, royal guards collapsed to their knees, weeping, hugging their comrades, while thousands of citizens gathered in the cathedral plazas below, clutching holy icons, awaiting the catastrophic beam of fire that would incinerate them all into dust. Grand Inquisitor Hector sneered, swinging his flaming sword downward. Fire, incinerate the Capitol. The Titans were exactly 1/2 of a second away from discharging their apocalyptic solar barrage. And then the world stopped. A sudden, bone-chilling, atmospheric shockwave detonated across the northern horizon. In less than 3 heartbeats, the bright golden morning sky was completely swallowed by an apocalyptic blizzard of midnight black frost clouds and howling sub-zero gale winds. The temperature on the battlefield plummeted by 90 degrees in 5 seconds. The burning grass was instantly extinguished beneath a 3-inch layer of black frost. The boiling heat radiating from the siege titans was choked out in an explosive hiss of freezing, blinding white steam. Grand Inquisitor Hector's eyes went wide with absolute shock. What in the gods' names is this mana signature? From the northern ridge of the Capitol Valley, the deep, primeval, earth-shaking blast of 50,000 synchronized war horns tore through the howling blizzard. The sound was so colossal, so deafening, that it physically vibrated the teeth of 350,000 Imperial soldiers. And then, through the swirling black mist of the blizzard, the sky turned silver. Thump, 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 thump. 50 massive, enchanted glacial harpoons of the void streaked across the sky like falling comets of ice. Before the Solarian engineers could even raise their energy shields, 10 15-foot frost-iron harpoons slammed directly into the chest apertures of the 3 lead sun-forged siege titans. The 0-degree cryo cores detonated inside the Titan's solar engines. The 4,000-degree plasma cores didn't explode. They instantly, violently froze into solid ice. The thermal shockwave was catastrophic. The 200-foot brass bodies of the 3 colossal titans fractured into millions of spiderweb cracks, before completely disintegrating into an avalanche of shattered crystal and frozen scrap metal, crushing 500 Imperial shock infantry beneath their collapsing hulls. Panic exploded through the Solarian front ranks. Titan 1, 2, and 3 are destroyed. What hit THEM? Look at the northern ridge. Look at the ridge. 350,000 Solarian soldiers and 1 million capital citizens turned their eyes in unison toward the northern ridge. Standing at the crest of the hill, emerging from the freezing mist in absolute, terrifying formation, was the Iron Ghost Legion. 50,000 legionnaires formed an unbroken, 3-mile wall of dark frost iron, their heavy tower shields interlocked, their frost lances gleaming with lethal azure mana. And riding out 50 paces ahead of the Legion, atop his massive coal-black warhorse, was Duke Ethan Vance. Ethan Vance wore his midnight black sovereign plate armor, his heavy wolf pelt billowing in the freezing gale, his grand cross of the sun blazing with the terrifying radiance of an ancient war god. In his hands, Ethan Vance drew his twin frost blades, pointing their pale blue tips directly toward Grand Inquisitor Hector's golden army. Inside Ethan Vance's soul, the 100 conquerors were no longer whispering. They were roaring with the glorious, unbridled fury of an empire about to be carved into the pages of history. Ethan Vance's voice didn't just carry across the valley. Amplified by his supreme warlord aura, it crashed across the 400,000-man battlefield like the judgment of the heavens itself. "SOLARIAN invaders," Ethan Vance roared across the plain. Ethan Vance's eyes burned with blinding, golden sovereignty. "You have entered the domain of House Vance. Throw down your blades and be shackled in chains, or watch me turn this valley into the graveyard of your empire." Up on the palace walls, Princess Sylvia wept tears of pure, ecstatic joy, pointing toward the northern ridge. "He has come, the Ashen War God has come." Down on the plains, Grand Inquisitor Hector's face contorted into a mask of rabid, furious disbelief, drawing his flaming broadsword. "Solar Legiones, crush THEM, leave not a single soul alive." The two greatest military forces on the continent had collided. And the bloodiest, most legendary battle in the history of the world had officially begun. There is a fundamental delusion that every massive empire falls prey to. They believe that sheer, overwhelming numbers can compensate for a total lack of tactical imagination. When you throw 350,000 men into a narrow valley against a general who possesses the combined memories of 100 historical conquerors, you aren't launching an invasion. You are simply delivering 350,000 bodies to a butcher's meat hook. Across the vast, snow-dusted plains outside the royal capital of Valerius, the ground was shaking with the force of an apocalyptic cataclysm. Grand Inquisitor Hector, his face contorted in rabid, wounded fury after watching 3 of his prized siege titans shattered into frozen crystal scrap, unsheathed his blazing 9-foot broadsword. "Solar Legiones, advance!" Hector roared through his golden helmet, his voice amplified by his 10th circle solar aura to sound like rolling thunder. "Overwhelm their ranks, drown those frozen dogs in their own blood." 350,000 Imperial soldiers surged forward across the 3-mile plain in an avalanche of gold and iron. The remaining 17 colossal, sun-forged siege titans stomped forward in a synchronized line, their massive iron feet crushing the frozen mud, their chest cores humming as they prepared a second, devastating solar barrage. Up on the northern ridge, standing in front of his 50,000-strong Iron Ghost Legion, Duke Ethan Vance didn't even raise his voice. He simply raised his right hand, 2 fingers extended toward the charging sea of gold. Inside Ethan Vance's mind, the 100 conquerors were operating with the terrifying, clockwork harmony of a grand master playing chess against a screaming child. "Look at their center," an ancient desert sovereign observed with a cool chuckle. "Their infantry is bunching up between the titans to avoid our harpoon batteries. They are creating their own fatal bottleneck." "Execute Phase 1, an Imperial Grand Tactician commanded. "Drop the floor beneath their feet." Ethan Vance dropped his fingers. "Detonate Sector 4 through 9, Ethan Vance commanded through his communication crystal. 5 miles away, beneath the surface of the charging Imperial Vanguard, 300 hidden subterranean sappers of the Black Lotus Consortium jammed their monarchies into the master detonator arrays. A series of 500 subterranean zero-degree mana cryomines detonated simultaneously beneath the central plain. The frozen earth didn't erupt with fire. It erupted with a catastrophic geyser of liquid sub-zero cryomana. In less than 10 seconds, a 2-mile trench of the charging Solarian Vanguard, over 60,000 heavy Imperial infantry, were instantly flash-frozen where they stood. Their boots were fused to the bedrock in 3 feet of solid, black glacial ice. The soldiers behind them, unable to stop their thundering forward momentum, collided violently into their frozen comrades, creating a colossal, chaotic human pileup that completely paralyzed the entire central Imperial advance. "Now," Ethan Vance whispered, "harpoon batteries target the secondary joints." Thump, 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 thump. 50 mobile ballista platforms unmasked their second volley. 200 enchanted glacial harpoons streaked through the freezing blizzard, bypassing the Titan's front armor and slamming directly into the hydraulic knee joints and coolant vents of the remaining 17 siege titans. The sub-zero cryo-mana detonated inside the mechanical leg hydraulics. One by one, the colossal 200-foot brass titans lost structural integrity. Their massive legs fractured like brittle glass, sending 17 walking fortresses crashing violently down into the mud. In a deafening series of seismic explosions that pulverized thousands of trapped Solarian soldiers beneath their colossal, burning hulls. In less than 8 minutes, the Solarian Empire's entire invincible siege vanguard had been reduced to a smoking, frozen junkyard. Down on the plains, Grand Inquisitor Hector looked around in absolute mind-shattering horror. His 17 titans were smoldering heaps of scrap metal. His central vanguard of 60,000 men was frozen solid in ice. His army's formation was shattered into fragmented, screaming pockets of panic. And that was precisely when Ethan Vance unleashed the hammer. Iron Ghost Legion, double wedge formation. Ethan Vance's voice boomed across the northern ridge like the judgment of the gods. Cleave them in half. From both flanks of the northern hills, 10,000 heavy shock cavalry mounted on armored northern battle rhinos erupted from the blizzard. Leading the left flank was Commander Gareth, swinging his 9-foot executioner's greatsword. His war rhino smashing through Imperial shield walls like a battering ram made of solid steel. Leading the right flank was Lieutenant Luke, directing 5,000 enchanted repeating crossbow skirmishers, who rained 10,000 armor-piercing frost bolts every 6 seconds into the disorganized Imperial lines. It wasn't a battle, it was a mathematical, multi-doctrine slaughterhouse. The Solarian soldiers, who had spent 10 years bullying smaller nations with overwhelming Titan firepower, had never experienced an enemy that moved with such terrifying, hive-mind precision. Every time an Imperial unit tried to form a defensive circle, an Iron Ghost harpoon battery erased their perimeter. Every time their solar mages tried to chant a high-tier spell, Ethan Vance's snipers put an enchanted bolt through their eye sockets. Within 20 minutes, the 350,000-man Imperial host was cut into 4 isolated pockets, surrounded on all sides by the unbreakable frost-iron wall of the Iron Ghost Legion. Seeing his entire glorious campaign collapsing into total, humiliating annihilation, Grand Inquisitor Hector completely lost his sanity. Surging with the full, unbridled fury of his 10th Circle Solar Core, Hector's body erupted into a blinding pillar of incandescent white-gold solar fire. The heat radiating from his armor was so intense that the frozen mud around him instantly turned into boiling steam. "Ethanvienci?" Hector roared, his eyes blazing like twin supernovas as he launched himself into the air like a flaming comet. "I will ash your soul into eternity." Hector descended from the sky, swinging his 9-foot blazing broadsword down in an apocalyptic strike known as the Wrath of the Seven Suns. The sheer kinetic force of the descending blade created a shockwave capable of leveling a 4-story fortress gate. Ethan Vance stepped forward alone into the center of the crater. He didn't draw a shield, he didn't summon an army. He simply drew his twin frost blades, their pale blue steel humming with the dark, primeval ashen void mana he had forged through 5 years of slaughtering northern gods. When Hector's flaming sword was 3 inches from Ethan Vance's skull, Ethan Vance executed the ancient void parry of the 100 sovereigns. Ting! The sound was not an explosion. It was a single, crystal-clear musical note of colliding steel. Ethan Vance's left frost blade met Hector's massive sword at an impossible 60-degree deflection angle. The 6,000-degree solar fire was instantly channeled harmlessly down into the bedrock, blowing a 30-foot trench behind Ethan Vance, while Ethan Vance's body remained completely, utterly motionless. Hector's eyes bulged with pure, unadulterated disbelief. How did you parry a 10th Circle solar strike with a one-handed blade?" Ethan Vance looked into Hector's terrified eyes, his lips curling into that cold, lethal smirk. "Because in my 100 past lives, Hector, I have killed gods who burned hotter than your little spark." In a flash of silver lightning that moved faster than human perception, Ethan Vance stepped inside Hector's guard. "Shrrrrrrk." Ethan Vance's right blade sliced clean through Hector's golden wrist, sending the flaming broadsword spinning into the mud. His left blade executed a backhanded slash, severing Hector's right knee tendon. Hector let out an agonized shriek, crashing down onto his left knee, clutching his bleeding stump. His golden sunplate armor cracking and peeling away under the freezing aura radiating from Ethan Vance's body. Ethan Vance rested the freezing, razor-sharp tip of his frost blade directly against the center of Hector's throat. The entire 400,000-man battlefield fell into dead, suffocating silence. 200,000 surviving Solarian soldiers stared in paralyzed horror. At their supreme Grand Inquisitor, the invincible champion of the Solarian Empire, kneeling in the mud with a sword at his neck, weeping in agony. "Your titans are scrap," Ethan Vance whispered, his voice echoing across the silent valley. "Your vanguard is broken. Your life belongs to me." Ethan Vance raised his head, his voice booming across the entire plain. "Solarian soldiers, throw down your weapons. If a single sword remains drawn in 5 seconds, I will exterminate every last one of you." Clang, clang, clang. Across the 3-mile plain, 200,000 Solarian soldiers threw their golden swords, their spears, and their shields into the mud. Dropping to their knees with their hands raised in total, unconditional surrender. Crek. The colossal, 5-foot-thick steel gates of the royal capital of Valerius swung wide open. Over 1 million citizens poured out onto the ramparts and through the archways, cheering, crying, throwing flowers, and banging iron pots in an explosion of deafening, ecstatic joy. King Valerius Roman III, wearing his golden robes, sprinted out through the gates, flanked by Princess Sylvia and the entire high court. When the king saw the 20 destroyed titans and 200,000 imperial soldiers kneeling in surrender before the 50,000-strong Iron Ghost Legion, the 70-year-old monarch fell to his knees in the mud, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated awe. Princess Sylvia rushed across the blood-stained snow, her eyes shining with tears of profound love and reverence. Throwing her arms around Ethan Vance's neck before the eyes of the entire kingdom. "You did it," Sylvia breathed, her voice trembling against his ear. "You saved us all, Ethan Vance." Ethan Vance gently placed his arm around Sylvia's waist, smiling softly down at the king and the cheering citizens of Valerius. The kingdom was saved. The Ashen War God had proven his absolute, untouchable supremacy. Yet, as Ethan Vance looked down at the bleeding, defeated Grand Inquisitor Hector kneeling at his feet, Hector let out a ragged, blood-soaked laugh. "You think you've won, Ethan Vance?" Hector rasped, spitting blood into the snow. "This was only the vanguard of the sun. Emperor Aurelius has already mobilized the Grand Armada of the 7 subjugated empires." Hector looked up with wide, demonic eyes. 2 million soldiers are marching behind US. The entire continent is marching to consume Valerius. Ethan Vance didn't flinch. He slowly looked toward the southern horizon, where the sky was turning a dark, apocalyptic crimson. The prelude was finished. And now, the true, cataclysmic battle of the 7 kingdoms was about to begin. There is an undeniable truth that every true conqueror understands. When you stand at the summit of a shattered mountain, you don't look down at the bodies you climbed over. You look up at the next mountain waiting to be conquered. In the 48 hours following the catastrophic annihilation of Grand Inquisitor Hector's vanguard on the capital plains, the kingdom of Valerius was reborn from its ashes. The 200,000 captured Solarian soldiers, expecting to be tortured, executed, or sold into brutal slavery, were stunned to find themselves treated under Ethan Vance's strict imperial meritocratic code. Their wounded were treated in field hospitals set up by the Black Lotus Consortium. Their weapons were confiscated, but their dignity was left intact. Ethan Vance gave them a simple, sovereign choice: remain chained as prisoners of war, or swear fealty to the grand sovereign domain of House Vance, earn fair wages, and fight for a leader who would never treat them as disposable cannon fodder. Over 180,000 battle-hardened imperial veterans dropped to their knees in tears and swore eternal allegiance to Ethan Vance on the spot. Meanwhile, inside the grand throne room of the royal capital, a historic transfer of power was taking place before the eyes of the entire realm. King Valerius Roman III, recognizing that his age and the corruption of his former council had nearly destroyed the nation, formally signed the Great Edict of Sovereign Unification. The king voluntarily stepped down into an honored elder advisory role, transferring supreme executive, military, and legislative authority of the entire kingdom permanently to Grand Sovereign Ethan Vance and Royal Regent Princess Sylvia. The four former duchies were dissolved and reorganized under 5 unified provincial administrative sectors, all linked directly to the industrial, technological, and economic heart of Ironspire. Through the Black Lotus Consortium, Ethan Vance injected millions of gold crowns into rebuilding the southern fortresses, standardizing the kingdom's currency, and constructing an unbroken network of paved highways and monotelegraph lines from the northern tundra to the southern mountains. In less than 3 weeks, the fragmented, bankrupt kingdom of Valerius had transformed into a unified, monolithic empire of iron, gold, and unbreakable discipline. The discarded boy who had been thrown into a frozen penal trench 5 years ago was now the absolute, undisputed supreme sovereign of the entire realm. And yet, Ethan Vance knew that the real storm had barely even begun. 1,000 miles to the south, the colossal, golden-domed metropolis of Solaria, the imperial capital of the continental Solarian Empire. Inside the Palace of the Everlasting Sun, a titanic cathedral of solid gold and white marble that could house 10,000 soldiers, Emperor Aurelius the Sun Conqueror sat upon his towering solar throne. Aurelius was a 200-year-old demigod of war, his body radiating a terrifying 11th circle sovereign solar aura that made the very air in the palace shimmer with searing heat. At the foot of the throne steps, a shattered magical communication crystal projected the final, humiliating memory of Grand Inquisitor Hector being dismantled, stripped of his arms, and forced to kneel in the snow by Ethan Vance. The 60 imperial dukes, archmages, and high marshals of the Solarian Empire stood in absolute, horrified silence, the temperature in the throne room rising by 300 degrees as the emperor's fury began to boil. Crack boom. Emperor Aurelius clenched his golden gauntlet, and the obsidian armrest of his throne was pulverized into dust. 350,000 men. Aurelius's voice rumbled like an erupting volcano, shaking the foundations of the entire city. 20 sun-forged siege titans, crushed in a single morning by a 24-year-old border general. An imperial grand marshal stepped forward, trembling with cold sweat. "Sire, our scouts report that Ethan Vance has not only annihilated the vanguard, but he has absorbed over 180,000 of our soldiers into his ranks. He has consolidated the entire northern and central provinces into an impenetrable fortress principality." Emperor Aurelius slowly stood up from his golden throne. His eyes blazed with blinding, apocalyptic white gold solar fire. And behind his back, an ethereal halo of 7 blazing suns materialized, illuminating the palace with divine wrath. "If a wild dog bites the hand of the sun, we do not send a single hunter," Aurelius declared, his voice echoing across the imperial capital like rolling thunder. "We burn the entire continent to the bedrock." The emperor raised his golden scepter to the sky, invoking the ancient blood pact of the 7 subjugated empires. "Issue the supreme mobilization decree. Summon the armadas of the 7 vassal kingdoms. Deploy all 200 sun-forged siege titans. And mobilize the 2 million imperial legionnaires." Aurelius pointed his scepter toward the northern horizon, his voice carrying the terrifying promise of total continental annihilation. "March, Solaria. Wipe the name of Valerius from the map of the world. And bring me the severed head of Ethambiensi." Within 7 days, the entire continent of Ethelgard was plunged into a state of absolute, apocalyptic terror. The sky above the southern mountain ranges turned a permanent, ominous blood red, as an army of 2 million soldiers, the largest military force in 5,000 years of recorded history, began their march across the continent. Free kingdoms, neutral principality leagues, and independent merchant states across the world were panicking. Foreign kings were packing their treasuries, borders were shutting down. and thousands of royal emissaries on high-speed magical mounts were galloping frantically across the highways, heading toward one single destination, the citadel of Ironspire. The entire world realized that there was only one fortress on the continent with the strength to resist the Solarian tide. There was only one general whose tactical genius defied the gods. And the fate of the entire civilization now rested squarely on the shoulders of the Ashen War God. Midnight, the high war room of Ironspire Citadel. The colossal holographic continental map in the center of the room was painted in a terrifying sea of red light, showing the colossal 2 million-man Solarian armada advancing like an unstoppable, apocalyptic tidal wave across the southern plains. Surrounding the 60-foot obsidian table stood the supreme command of the newly unified realm. Princess Sylvia, wearing her royal battle regalia of silver plate and azure silk, her eyes sharp and resolute. Commander Gareth, wearing his customized frost iron titan armor, his 9-foot greatsword resting against his shoulder. Lieutenant Luke, managing the continent-wide shadow intelligence feeds of the Black Lotus Consortium. And 50 veteran generals and newly integrated division commanders, standing at rigid, unyielding military attention. The double iron doors of the war room swung open. Ethan Vance walked into the chamber. He wore his majestic sovereign armor of the Ashen Dragon, forged from pure glacial frost iron and starcore steel, radiating an aura of dark, absolute, and untouchable authority. Across his broad shoulders rested his iconic white wolf pelt, and at his hip hung his twin frost blades, their steel humming with the compressed power of 100 conquered lifetimes. As Ethan Vance stepped onto the command dais, every single general and commander in the room placed their right fist over their chest plate. Slamming their heels together in a thunderous, synchronized salute, "Hail the Grand Sovereign, hail the Ashen War God." Ethan Vance looked around the table, his dark eyes meeting the gaze of every single leader in the room. Inside Ethan Vance's soul, the ethereal chamber of the 100 conquerors lit up with a blinding, golden blaze. The 100 ancient warlords, grand chancellors, and imperial tacticians stood around their celestial round table, raising their ghost blades in absolute, unified salute to their living master. Ethan Vance slowly reached down, placing his hand upon the southern border of the holographic continental map. 2 million soldiers, Ethan Vance said softly, his voice smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of fear. He looked up at Princess Sylvia, a faint, confident smirk playing upon his lips. "They threw me to the frozen mud when I was 18, hoping the cold would bury my name." Ethan Vance's eyes flared with the terrifying, golden fire of an emperor, about to carve his destiny across the stars. "And now, the greatest empires of the world have gathered their armies just to stand before my gates." Ethan Vance drew his right frost blade with a clean, razor-sharp SHRRRNG, pointing the gleaming blue steel straight through the holographic projection of Emperor Aurelius's golden capital. "Gareth Luke Sylvia." Ethan Vance's voice echoed across Ironspire Citadel and through the hearts of 200,000 waiting legionnaires like thunder before the storm. "Sound the great horns of the Iron Ghost Legion, prepare the glacial Titan batteries, open the subterranean armories." Ethan Vance's lips curved into that signature legendary smirk that had terrorized barbarian kings and imperial inquisitors alike. "Because tomorrow morning, we do not merely defend our borders." Ethan Vance's voice dropped to a chilling, earth-shaking whisper. "Tomorrow, we conquer the continent." And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the breathtaking, explosive conclusion of this massive 3-hour Manhwa journey. From a discarded, quiet, noble son betrayed by his cowardly father and sent to die in the frozen northern meat grinder, to unleashing the tactical genius of 100 historical conquerors, building the continent's most powerful shadow economic syndicate, dismantling his corrupt family with cold, surgical perfection, and ascending as the supreme grand sovereign of the realm. The stage is officially set for the greatest, most cataclysmic clash of titans this world has ever seen, the Battle of the Seven Kingdoms, where Ethan Vance and his invincible Iron Ghost Legion will march to face the 2 million-strong armada of the Solarian Empire. If you enjoyed every single second of this epic zero-to-hero strategic masterclass, Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Fate Library with all notifications turned on. And if you're craving even more mind-blowing, high-stakes Manhwa stories with overpowered main characters, savage revenge, and god-tier progression fantasy, make sure to click on the screen right now and check out the previous videos on our channel Fate Library. There are dozens of incredible adventures waiting for you in the library. Thank you so much for watching, take care of yourselves, and we will see you all in the very next story, right here on Fate Library.